The first thing he felt was cold. Not the kind of cold you feel when you step outside in winter without a jacket, but the kind where your whole body feels like someone else's and you can't tell where your fingers end. Ethan opened his eyes and saw the sky. Gray, low, alien. He was lying on stone slabs in the middle of a courtyard, surrounded by people in long robes. A priest with a wrinkled face held his palm over Ethan and muttered something in a language Ethan didn't know, but he understood. Every word drove into his head like a nail into soft wood. The naming ceremony, 15th birthday, class determined. Ethan blinked and a translucent window appeared before his eyes, filled with letters that glowed dimly like the dying screen of an old phone. Class, Archer, rank, F. Strength, 4. Dexterity, 6. Mana, 1. Weapon, a novice's wooden bow. Special ability, trajectory accumulation. He read it twice, then once more. People around him laughed, not maliciously, worse, with pity. A girl in a fancy dress turned away and covered her mouth with her hand. The priest sighed and went somewhere behind the altar. He returned with a bow that looked as if it had been forgotten in the basement 20 years ago. The bowstring was sagging, the wood was cracked. He didn't want to touch one shoulder because it was darker than the other from the dampness. The priest shoved the bow into Ethan's hands and looked away. Ethan weighed the weapon in his palms. His fingers were thin, like a child's. There were no calluses. The hands weren't his. The body wasn't his. The world wasn't his. But his brain was working, and his brain was telling him things that a 15-year-old orphan from a border village couldn't possibly know. The initial velocity of the projectile at this draw length is 40 meters per second. The arrow weighs 30 grams. If you factor out air resistance and calculate using the range formula, taking the angle of elevation into account, you get 80 meters under ideal conditions. But the conditions aren't ideal. The bow is shoddy. The arrow is crooked. His arms are weak. The actual range is 20 meters, maybe 25. He looked at the straw dummy 20 paces away from him. The priest nodded, as if to say, "Come on, kid, show me what you've got." Ethan raised the bow. He knocked the arrow. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but because the muscles of this body weren't used to the strain. He drew the bowstring up to his ear as someone else's muscle memory prompted him. He took aim. He released. The arrow veered downward and stuck in the ground a meter short of the scarecrow. The laughter grew louder. Someone slapped their knee. Someone whistled. The village headman's daughter walked away without looking back. Ethan stood there, staring at the arrow sticking out of the mud. And in the corner of his eye, something flickered quietly. +1 centimeter in range. Forever. He froze. He read it again. +1 centimeter of range. Forever. Not just until the end of the battle. Not just until the end of the day. Forever. A permanent increase. With every shot, Ethan slowly lowered his bow. He looked at his hands, at his thin, boyish fingers with the skin scraped off his index finger, and he smiled. For the first time in this body, for the first time in 15 years of someone else's life and 24 of his own. To those around him, he looked like a pathetic F-rank boy smiling after a failure, probably from the shock. Poor thing. But Ethan wasn't smiling out of shock. He was smiling because something clicked in his head. 1 centimeter per shot. 100 shots is 1 meter. 1,000 is 10 meters. 10,000 is 100. If he shoots 1,000 a day, in a month his range will increase by 300 meters. In 3 months, by a kilometer. In a year, he didn't even bother to calculate any further, because he'd grasped the main point. This system doesn't know who he is. It gave him an F rank and an ability that seems useless. 1 centimeter. Ridiculous. Pathetic. Who would fire 10,000 shots just to gain a measly 100 meters? Who would even bother counting? Ethan Ray Cross would. Because in his past life, he calculated corrections for the Earth's rotation for projectiles flying beyond the horizon. And if this ability works the way he thinks it does, then it has no limit. The priest touched his shoulder and said the ritual was over. He said he'd be given a spot in the caravan to the capital. The Silver Arrow Academy now accepts everyone, even F ranks. Ethan nodded. He thanked him. He picked up his bow and walked toward the wagon that was supposed to take him away from this village. Along the way, he picked up his arrow from the mud, wiped it on his pant leg, and tucked it into his quiver. It was his first arrow, 1 centimeter long. Forever. The journey to the capital took 9 days. The wagon creaked over every rock. 3 others like him were sitting nearby. 2 boys with the porters and herb gatherers classes, both F rank. Both were silent. The third was a girl with the D rank archer class. She sat apart and looked off into the distance. So-yeon Han, the daughter of a baron from a neighboring province. Ethan learned this because the driver had called out her name when he helped her get into the wagon. She didn't look at anyone. Her back was straight. Her hands were on her knees. Her fingers were clenched. At every stop, Ethan would walk behind the wagon. He'd find a flat spot. He'd take out his bow, and he shot. At a tree, at a rock, at a pile of leaves. It didn't matter where. What mattered was shooting. On the first day, he shot 40 arrows. By evening, his fingers were rubbed raw down to the pink skin. The bowstring had left a groove on his index and middle fingers. His shoulder ached so much that he couldn't raise his arm above his ear. But in the corner of his eye stood a number. Plus 40 centimeters. Forever. On the second day, he shot 60. He wrapped his fingers in a strip of cloth torn from the hem of his shirt. It didn't help much. Blood was seeping through the fabric by noon. The coachman glanced at him askance and asked why he was torturing himself. Ethan replied that he wanted to learn how to shoot. The coachman snorted and said that an F-rank archer would be better off learning to carry shields behind real fighters. Ethan nodded and continued shooting. On the third day, So-yeon looked at him for the first time. He stood behind the bushes by the roadside, firing arrow after arrow at the trunk of an old ash tree from 15 paces away. He hit it every other time, but every miss landed the same centimeter away as a hit. The system couldn't tell the difference. So-yeon watched for about 10 seconds. Then she looked away. But Ethan noticed that she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at his hands, at the blood seeping through the rag, at how he winced with every pull yet kept shooting anyway. By the end of the road, he had fired 412 arrows. His range had increased by 4 meters and 12 centimeters. Now he was shooting 24 meters. Still pitiful, still ridiculous. But Ethan wasn't laughing. He was calculating. And he was writing tiny numbers with a piece of charcoal on the inside of his quiver. Numbers that no one but him could read. Initial velocity, 41 meters per second. Arrow weight, 32 grams. Elevation angle for maximum range, 43 degrees. Wind correction not determined. Needs an anemometer or at least a wet finger. The Silver Arrow Academy greeted them on the 10th day. Gray walls 5 stories high, towers with flags, a wide courtyard paved with stone, and a gate through which 2 columns of cadets entered at the same time. The right column marched along the paved road. Spotless uniforms, nice boots. Their weapons glistened in the sun. A ranks and B ranks. They were met by instructors who bowed. The left column trudged through the mud along the wall. Wrinkled uniforms, wooden weapons, confused faces, F ranks and E ranks. They were met by a single guard on duty who pointed toward the basement and said that the bunks were to the right and dinner would be in 2 hours if there was any left. Ethan set off down the stairs into a long corridor with a low ceiling. It smelled of dampness and old wood. A room for 8 people. 4 bunk beds, mattresses stuffed with straw. A single, small window near the ceiling through which a patch of sky was visible. He set his quiver on the bottom bunk by the wall. He sat down. He looked around. A skinny guy with dark circles under his eyes was already settling in next to him. He was breathing heavily and with a wheezing sound. Asthma. Ethan could tell by the sound. The guy introduced himself. Minjun, swordsman, F rank. He said he was glad to meet him, though his face made it clear he wasn't glad about anything in the world. On the bunk next to him sat a girl with red hair and a pale face. She was staring at her hands and saying nothing. Claire, healer, E rank. Ethan recognized her class because a faint green healing symbol glowed on her wrist. He nodded to both of them. He said his name. He said his class. Minjun looked at his bow and said nothing. Claire looked at his bandaged fingers and also said nothing. But something like recognition flashed in her eyes. Not him. His pain. She was a healer. She saw wounds. Even if she was afraid of blood. Ethan lay down on the cot. He closed his eyes and began counting in his head. 1,000 shots a day. 10 meters of progress. 30 days. 300 meters. No, too slow. He needed more. He needed to shoot at night when everyone was asleep. He needed to find a shooting range. He needed to find material for arrows because those 3 pitiful sticks in his quiver wouldn't last even a week. He needed to find a way to treat his hands because by the 3rd day of training, he wouldn't even be able to hold a spoon. He needs to stay inconspicuous. F rank, quiet, weak, safe. No one must know what's going on. No one must see the numbers on the quiver. No one must count his arrows. He rolled onto his side. It was getting dark outside the small window near the ceiling. Somewhere upstairs, people were laughing, probably the A-ranks in their wing with the porcelain tableware. Downstairs, it was quiet. Min-jun had already fallen asleep and was breathing with a faint whistle. Playlist sat on her bunk, hugging her knees. Ethan waited another hour. Then he quietly got up. He took his bow and quiver and stepped out into the hallway. The shooting range was located behind the north wing, a long strip of trampled earth with straw targets at various distances. The closest ones stood 30 paces away. The far ones were 100 paces away. The farthest one stood alone by the stone wall at the edge of the academy grounds. 150 meters. For A ranks. At night, the range was empty. No guards, no torches, just the moon and silence. Ethan stood in front of the nearest target. He took out an arrow, raised his bow. His hands ached, his fingers burned beneath the bandage. He drew the bowstring and released it. The arrow landed on the edge of the straw circle. Crooked, low, but it landed +1 centimeter. He took out a second arrow, shot it, +1 centimeter. A third, a fourth, a fifth. By the 30th arrow, his fingers had started to bleed through the bandage. By the 50th, he could no longer feel the index finger of his right hand. By the 100th, his shoulder burned as if someone had driven a red-hot nail into the joint. He didn't stop. He gathered the arrows, returned to his position, and started over. On the first night, he fired 320 arrows. 3 broke. All that remained were the ones he picked up and reused. His range increased by 3 meters and 20 centimeters. His total range was 27 meters. He returned to the basement before dawn. He lay down on his cot. He hid his hands under the blanket so no one would see the blood. And he slept until the bell rang. Classes began in the morning. The archery instructor turned out to be a woman of about 22 with short dark hair and a calm gaze. Hannah Ryerson, a former B-rank archer in the Royal Guard. She surveyed the line of cadets, and not a single muscle in her face twitched when she saw Ethan with his wooden bow. She simply nodded and began explaining the basics. Stance, grip, breathing, aiming. Ethan listened intently, not because he didn't know these things, but because he wanted to understand how they taught archery in this world. It turned out to be primitive. No calculations, no adjustments. Aim with your eye. Shoot by instinct. Mana will guide the arrow. Mana. He had a single point of mana. It wouldn't guide the arrow anywhere. But Ethan didn't need mana. He needed physics. And physics worked the same way in Alabama as it did in Illyrian. The first week passed at a pace that would have made a normal person's arms give out. Classes during the day. Archery under Hannah's supervision. Dumb training bows. Targets 30 paces away. Ethan deliberately missed every other shot so as not to stand out. The system didn't care. Every miss cost him a centimeter. In the evening, he'd go down to the basement. He'd eat whatever was left over from the upperclassmen. Usually it was porridge and bread. Sometimes a piece of boiled meat if he was lucky. Then he'd wait until everyone was asleep, and he'd head out to the range, every night, without exception. By the end of the first week, he'd fired more than 2,000 arrows. His range had surpassed 40 meters. His fingers had stopped bleeding. A thick layer of calluses had formed. His shoulder had grown accustomed to the strain. The body of a 15-year-old boy adapted faster than he'd expected. Young muscles, quick recovery. The only thing slowing him down was the arrows. The 3 remaining from the ritual were already in such poor condition that Ethan was afraid to string them. The arrowheads had become dull. The shafts were cracked. The fletching had fallen off. He began looking for materials. A hazel bush grew behind the basement. Ethan cut a dozen twigs after lights out. He brought them into the room and began whittling them with a knife he didn't have. He found a shard of stone in the backyard and whittled the shafts against its edge. Slowly, crookedly, but it worked. Min-jun woke up on the third night and saw Ethan sitting on the floor with a pile of shavings around him. He asked what he was doing. Ethan replied that he was whittling arrows. Min-jun was silent for a moment. Then he asked why. Ethan said he needed the arrows for practice. Min-jun looked at his hands. At the calluses. At the worn-away skin. At the dark spots of dried blood under his fingernails. And he said that Ethan was either the most determined person he'd ever seen, or the craziest. Ethan thought for a moment and replied that it was probably both. Min-jun smiled. for the first time since they'd been in the basement. Then he pulled a small folding knife from under his bunk, one he'd been hiding from the instructors, and silently held it out. Ethan took the knife and nodded. He didn't say anything else, but he remembered. In the third week, what Ethan had both been waiting for and fearing at the same time finally happened. Instructor Hannah organized a demonstration shooting session. Each cadet had to shoot at a target 100 steps away. A ranks hit easily. B ranks struggled but still hit. D ranks missed but at least hit the target. So-Yun fired. The arrow flew but veered off course. Her hands were shaking. Hannah said nothing. She simply made a note in the logbook. Then it was Ethan's turn. 100 steps, about 70 meters. His actual range at that point was 62 meters. He couldn't hit the target. Physically, the arrow wouldn't make it. But he could shoot. And every shot added a centimeter. Ethan took his position. He bowed. He said, "I'm sorry, but I probably won't make it." Hannah nodded and said, "Let him try." The cadets giggled. One of the A-rankers, quipped that an F-rank archer should aim for the sky. Maybe he'd knock down a crow. Ethan raised his bow, drawn it back, released it. The arrow flew off and stuck into the ground about 8 meters from the target. Someone laughed. Ethan asked for permission to shoot again. Hannah gave her permission. The second arrow landed a little farther away. The third one landed even farther. Not a single one made it. Hannah gave him a long look. Then she nodded and let it go. Ethan walked away from the range with his head down, just as an F-rank failure should. But inside, he was doing the math. 3 shots, 3 centimeters. And most importantly, he now knew exactly how far the target was. And the wind. And the angle. And the fact that, at the current projectile velocity, his arrow loses about 4 centimeters of altitude for every 10 meters of flight. That evening, he wrote it all down on the inside of his quiver. Initial velocity, 47 meters per second. Drift with a 3 meters per second westerly wind equals 4.2 meters per 100 steps. Elevation correction, plus 11 centimeters. That night, he went out to the range. 100 shots at that very same target. The first 20 missed. The 30th landed at the base. The 50th stuck into the lower edge. The 70th hit the center. The 100th shot pierced the straw circle right through. The range increased in real time. Each shot added a centimeter. By the 100th shot, his range was already 63 meters, and the target stood 70 meters away. But the arrows flew farther than the system indicated because Ethan calculated the angle of elevation and used a parabolic trajectory. The system calculated the horizontal range, but the actual projectile flies in an arc. By dawn, the target was destroyed. Straws hung in tatters. The central circle had turned into a ragged hole. The wooden frame had cracked from the sheer number of hits. Ethan gathered up the arrows. He covered his tracks and left. In the morning, during roll call, the range instructor was yelling. Someone had destroyed the target during the night, blown it to smithereens. Who? Silence. Ethan stood in formation, staring at the ground. One of the cadets suggested it might have been an upperclassman. Someone else said it could have been animals. Ethan quietly said it was probably deer. No one paid any attention. F-rank. What could he know? Hannah stood slightly to the side, watching Ethan. For a long time, intently. Then she looked away. By the end of the third week, his range was 78 meters. He shot at night. He whittled arrows during the day. He hid everything under his bunk. Minjun knew Ethan was leaving at night but didn't ask. Claire saw his hands every morning and said nothing. But one day she left a small jar of ointment on his pillow. No note, no words. Ethan opened the jar. He sniffed it. The ointment smelled of herbs and something slightly sweet. He rubbed it onto his fingers. The burning sensation went away in a minute. His skin softened. The cracks began to heal. He looked at Claire. She was reading a textbook and pretending nothing had happened. Ethan closed the jar. He tucked it under his pillow. And that night, he shot 100 more arrows than usual. Because his hands didn't hurt. For the first time in 3 weeks. By the end of the first month, his range was 94 meters. Almost 100. Almost. The hazel arrows flew straighter than he'd expected, but the arrowheads were a problem. The stone ones crumbled. The bone ones cracked. He needed metal, and metal cost money, which he didn't have. He began to think, and the solution came from where he least expected it. In the backyards of the academy stood a blacksmith's shop. Small, sooty, with a door that was always open from which the smell of coal and hot iron wafted. A girl worked there, wearing a leather apron over her cadet uniform. Minju Park, blacksmith, C rank, the only one in her class authorized to forge weapons. Ethan watched her for 3 days. She worked furiously. The hammer struck the anvil with a rhythm that made his ears ring. But every time a customer from the upperclassmen came in and asked for a ceremonial bow with gold inlay, her face would harden. She did the work, but she hated every blow. Ethan waited until evening. He came to the smithy when Minju was alone. He knocked on the open door. She turned around. She looked at his wooden bow, at his bandaged fingers, at the crumpled template, and asked what he wanted. Ethan pulled a piece of parchment from his bosom. A sketch was drawn on it in small handwriting. An arrowhead, not the usual triangular one, a different shape, elongated, with 3 sides, and with precise measurements in millimeters. The work in the forge turned out to be harder than Ethan had expected. The bellows were so heavy that his whole body hung from the lever. He had to haul buckets of coal from the basement across the yard. The heat from the forge burned his face and hands. After 2 hours, he could barely stand on his feet. Minju looked at him and shook her head. But he forged the arrowheads, 20 of them in 3 evenings, each one exactly according to the blueprint. 3 facets, an elongated tip, 14 grams in weight. Ethan picked up the first finished arrowhead and turned it over in his fingers. The metal was good, the facets were smooth, the balance was just right. He fitted the arrowhead onto a hazel shaft. He wrapped it with wire. He checked the alignment, set it aside and picked up the second one. He assembled all 20 overnight. In the morning, he arrived at the range before anyone else. The first shot with the new arrow flew 7 meters farther than usual. The projectile's mass had changed. The center of gravity had shifted forward. The aerodynamics were cleaner. Ethan smiled and jotted down the new figures on his quiver. Initial velocity, 47 meters per second. Projectile weight, 44 grams. Optimal elevation angle, 42 degrees. Correction accepted. By the middle of the second month, his range had surpassed 120 meters. He could hit any target on the range, including that distant one standing by the wall for a ranks. But he didn't shoot at it during the day, only at night, and only when he was sure no one was watching. During the day, he remained the same quiet boy with a wooden bow. He missed his shots in class. He bowed after every miss. He apologized for his weakness. Hannah gave him C's for his persistence and said nothing. But sometimes Ethan caught her gaze on him, a long, thoughtful, as if she were trying to solve a problem that lacked enough information. So-yeon trained next to him every day. The instructor had assigned her to be his mentor, to drag the weakling along with her. She took it seriously. She demonstrated the stance. She corrected his grip. She explained how to breathe before shooting. Ethan listened and nodded. He already knew all that and much more, but he was watching something else, her hands. Every time So-yeon released the bowstring, the fingers of her right hand twitched, slightly, almost imperceptibly, but Ethan saw it, and he counted. The tremor began half a second before the shot. The amplitude was 3 millimeters. At a distance of 30 paces, this resulted in a deviation of 5 centimeters. Tolerable, but at 100 paces, the deviation grew to 15. And at 200, the arrow veered off course. So-yeon knew about her tremor. Everyone knew. She couldn't control it. It wasn't due to weakness. It wasn't due to poor technique. It was all in her head. Ethan realized this during his second week of observation, when he saw her shoot calmly and steadily during practice. But then, during the exam in front of everyone, her hands would start shaking uncontrollably. Fear. Not of the targets, of people. Of the eyes watching her. Her father's voice telling her she was a disgrace. Ethan thought about it for 4 days. Then, for 3 nights in a row, he didn't shoot, he planed wood. A bow. Not for himself, for her. He took a standard ash blank, but he shifted the point where the grip attached 1.5 centimeters below the center. He weighted down the lower limb of the bow with an insert made of dense hazelwood. He wrapped the grip with a strip of leather in 3 layers. Each layer was a different thickness. The result was simple. The bow weighed 200 grams more than a standard one. The grip fit more snugly in his palm. The center of gravity shifted downward, and when his hand trembled, the bow stayed in place. The weight dampened the tremor. Physics, no magic. He left the bow in its place in the archery hall early that morning. No note. Soyeon came to practice and saw it. She picked it up. She frowned. She looked around. No one was there. She raised the bow. She drew it back, and she froze. Her hand didn't tremble. She drew it back further. Her hand remained steady. She released the string. The arrow hit the center of the target. Soyeon stood there and stared at it for about 10 seconds. Then she shot again. Center. Again. Center. 3 out of 3. She lowered the bow and her lips twitched. Ethan was watching from behind the weapons rack, where he was pretending to sort through arrows. She turned around. She scanned the room. Ethan lowered his eyes and continued sorting through the arrows. Soyeon didn't say anything, but she didn't give the bow back. And that evening, Ethan saw her sitting on the steps by the basement, holding the bow on her lap and stroking the leather wrapping with her fingertips, as if it were something precious, like something she'd never had before. The second week of the second month brought a problem. Claire, her practical medicine exam was in 10 days. And she couldn't pass it. Not because she didn't know the theory. She knew the theory better than anyone else in the class. She could list all 200 types of medicinal herbs. She could describe the structure of the body down to the last bone. She could explain how healing magic works at the cellular level. But she couldn't stand the sight of blood. The sight of blood made her nauseous. Her hands shook. Her vision blurred. She once fainted during a practical session when an A-rank cadet cut his hand with a training sword. It was a minor cut, just a drop of blood. Claire collapsed as if she'd been mowed down. Everyone laughed, even the instructor. A healer who's afraid of blood? What a joke. Ethan watched her and thought. Nausea at the sight of blood. A classic vasovagal reaction. But something didn't add up. He'd seen Claire change the bandages on his fingers without flinching. She'd seen blood on the bandages and hadn't fainted. So it wasn't the sight of it. What was it then? He began to observe more closely, and on the third day he realized the smell. Blood smells like iron. A fresh wound smells stronger. In the enclosed room where the practical training took place, the smell was concentrated. Claire didn't turn pale when she saw blood, but when she leaned close enough to the wound to smell it. Ethan remembered his grandmother from Alabama. She worked in a livestock yard and couldn't stand the smell of blood. She wore a mask with a fabric lining stuffed with dried lavender. The lavender masked the smell of iron. Simple and crude, but it worked. He found some lavender in the academic garden. He dried it on the basement windowsill overnight, placing it next to the heating pipe. He cut a mask out of a piece of thick fabric. He placed a layer of dried lavender between the fabric layers. He sewed on the straps. He waited until Claire left for class and left the mask on her pillow. He placed a note next to it. He wrote that it was for the smell, that she needed to wear it during practical training, that the lavender masked the smell of iron. He didn't sign it. Claire came back in the evening. She saw the mask. She read the note. She looked at Ethan, who was lying on his bunk pretending to be asleep. She looked at Min-jun, who was actually asleep. She picked up the mask. She sniffed it and pressed it to her face. Her shoulders trembled. She stood there like that for a minute. Then she tucked the mask under her pillow and lay down. Ethan could hear her breathing. It was uneven, with sobs, but quiet. 10 days later, Claire took her practical exam. She applied a bandage to a laceration. She stopped the bleeding. She healed the skin with magic. She didn't turn pale. She didn't faint. The lavender-scented mask covered the lower half of her face, and the examiner didn't object because many healers wore masks when treating wounds. Claire received a good grade, her first ever at the academy. She returned to the basement and tossed the gradebook onto Ethan's cot. He raised an eyebrow. Claire said she didn't know who'd left the mask, but whoever it was an idiot, and that she hadn't cried, and that lavender smelled awful. And that thanks. She blurted all that out in one breath, blushed to her ears, and left. Min-jun opened one eye, looked at Ethan, and closed again. By the end of the second month, Ethan was shooting every night without a break. His range was increasing. 140 meters, 160, 180. He began to notice things he hadn't noticed before. The wind changed 3 times a night. Humidity affected the arrow's flight. Cold air is denser. An arrow flies a shorter distance in it, but more steadily. Warm air is thinner. The arrow flies farther, but has a harder time maintaining its trajectory. He wrote everything down. New data every night. Temperature, humidity, wind direction, speed. He remembered how, at his last job, he'd created ballistic tables for artillery shells. The same principles, the same variables, only instead of a shell, an arrow. Instead of a cannon, a bow. Instead of a computer, his mind. By his 201st day at the academy, his range was 210 meters. He could hit a target from a distance that A-rank archers considered the limit. But he shot consistently from that distance, 10 out of 10, in any wind. The U-bow changed everything. The initial velocity rose to 62 meters per second. The range at the same elevation angle jumped 30 meters at once. But most importantly, the bow's limbs worked more smoothly. The arrow left the string without a jerk, without vibration, cleanly. Ethan recalculated all the tables in a single night. New projectile weight, new optimal angle, new wind adjustments. Everything was recalculated. Everything was written in small handwriting on the inside of the quiver. The third month began with rain. The range turned to mud by midnight. The arrows got stuck in the mud. The bowstring got wet and lost tension. Ethan found some wax at Minju's blacksmith shop and treated the bowstring with it. The moisture problem lessened but didn't go away. He began shooting from under the awning by the northern wall of the range. The distance was shorter, but his accuracy was better. By the end of the third month, his range had exceeded 240 meters. Twice he accidentally hit a tree behind the academy wall. Both times at night. Both times he heard the arrow enter the wood with a dull thud. And both times he stood there for a long time, calculating the distance from the awning to the wall, the height of the wall, the launch angle, and the ballistic curve. The arrow flew over the wall and continued another 100 meters. That meant the actual range along the parabola was already greater than the system's measured range. The system showed 240. The actual range, taking the arc into account, was closer to 300. Ethan noted the difference, and he began to think about what would happen when the range reached a kilometer. The thought was strange, almost unreal. But the math didn't lie. 1,000 shots a day, a 10-meter increase, 100 days, 1 kilometer, 3.5 months. By summer, if his hands could hold out. His hands held out. Claire's ointment helped. She left a little jar on his pillow once a week. Without a word, he left her small gifts in return. Dried herbs for her studies, parchment for notes. Once, a small wooden owl figurine he'd carved overnight from a hazel scrap. Claire placed the owl on the windowsill and didn't tell anyone where it came from. Soyeon started shooting better. Not just better, noticeably better. The heavier bow had eliminated her tremor, and for the first time in 6 months, she was hitting the target consistently. The archery instructor noted her progress. Even Hannah nodded during practice, barely noticeably. Soyeon straightened her shoulders. Her back became even straighter, if that was possible. But Ethan could see that the problem hadn't gone away. The tremor was hiding, waiting. During regular training sessions, the bow kept her hands steady. But when Soyeon was truly nervous, the tremor returned even through the weight of the heavy bow handle. It happened during the quarterly exam. The entire class lined up on the range, instructors with their logbooks, senior students on the stands, a representative from the House of Wei in the front row, a handsome young man in expensive clothes, Sir Cassian, the Duke's heir, an A-rank swordsman. He had come to observe the class's progress, and at the same time, to check on how his younger sister Iris was doing. Soyeon took her position. The target was 50 paces away, a children's distance for D rank. She raised her bow, and her hands trembled. Not slightly as usual, but violently, noticeably so. The bow was shaking violently. She saw Cassian in the stands. She saw the instructors. She saw the eyes watching her. And her father's voice echoed in her head. A disgrace to the family. Shame. The first arrow plunged into the ground in front of the target. Someone in the stands clicked their tongue. The second flew 2 meters to the right. Cassian leaned over to his neighbor and said something. The neighbor smirked. The third arrow missed entirely. Soyeon lowered her bow. She stood there for a second. Then she silently walked away from her position. The instructor noted 3 misses out of 3 in the logbook. She had failed the exam. Ethan stood in formation and watched. His face was impassive. His eyes were calm. Something tightened inside him. Not anger, calculation. He memorized Cassian's face. He memorized the smirk on his face. He memorized the distance from the stands to the shooting position, 480 meters, just in case. That evening, Soyeon was sitting on the roof of the basement. The roof was flat and low. From there, she could see a section of the training ground and part of the wall. Soyeon sat there in silence. Ethan found her an hour later. He climbed the stairs and sat down beside her. He didn't ask if she was okay. It was obvious she wasn't. He just sat there beside her and said nothing. A minute. 2. 5. Then he pulled a bow from his bosom. That very one. Heavier, but modified. He'd added a second birchwood insert to the upper shoulder, shifted the balance another half centimeter, increased the thickness of the leather wrapping on the handle, and most importantly, he'd added a small leather support under the wrist that stabilized the hand at the moment of release. The tremor caused by nerves starts in the shoulder, but it manifests in the wrist. If you stabilize the wrist, the tremor won't reach the fingers. He handed the bow to Soyeon. She looked at him. Her eyes were red. Her cheeks were wet. Ethan said he wasn't good with words. He said he was good at math. He said he'd figured out where her tremor was coming from and fixed it. He asked her to try again tomorrow. Soyeon looked at him. For a long time. The way no one in her life had ever looked at her before. Not with pity, not with disappointment, with the precise, calm attention of someone who sees a problem and solves it. She picked up the bow. She ran her fingers over the leather grip, over the wrapping, over the elm wood insert. She didn't understand its purpose, but she felt that with it, the bow lay differently in her hand, more correctly. She nodded. Ethan nodded back. He stood and walked away. The smell of resin from fresh wood lingered on the roof. In the morning, Soyeon asked the instructor for a retake. The instructor looked at her and agreed. She took her position. The target was 50 paces away. She raised the bow. Her arm held steady. The leather wrist guard encircled her wrist. The weight of the grip pulled her downward. A tremor came over her and was swallowed up by the solid heaviness of the wood and metal. Soyeon exhaled. She released the string. Bullseye. She reloaded. Second shot. Bullseye. Third. Bullseye. Fourth. Fifth. Sixth. Bullseye. Bullseye. Center. She kept shooting until the instructor stopped her. 10 out of 10. The instructor silently crossed out the 3 in the logbook and gave her the highest score. Soyeon lowered her bow. Her hands weren't shaking. She turned around. Her eyes found Ethan in the formation. He was standing there, staring at the floor. As always, quiet, unobtrusive. She gripped the bow tighter. That evening, a letter arrived from her father. Soyeon read the first line. Then she folded the letter and placed it on Ethan's bunk, as a bookmark for the parchment with calculations that he kept hidden there. Ethan returned that night. He saw the letter, unfolded it, read it. The first line said he was glad to hear about her successes. The rest didn't matter. He folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket next to Hannah's note. 2 pieces of paper, both from strangers, both, for some reason, warm. The following week, Ethan noticed Iris Valemore for the first time. Not because he wanted to, because she was coughing. The wind mage, a rank, a senior in the class, 1 year ahead of his brother. Beautiful with a cold beauty that made you want to take a step back. Perfect posture, perfect figure. The icy gaze of her gray eyes. And the cough. Quiet. Dry. After every combat magic training session. Ethan watched as she walked around the corner and pressed a handkerchief to her lips. He saw the handkerchief disappear into her sleeve. He saw her breathing become ragged after every spell. Wind mages worked with air. They accelerated it, compressed it, turned it into blades. But every spell took a piece of something from her lungs that could not be restored. A lung disease. Occupational. Rare. Ethan didn't know what it was called in this world, but he knew what deteriorating lungs looked like. In his past life, his father had worked in a factory and died of pneumoconiosis. He'd slowly suffocated for 3 years. The same dry cough. The same handkerchief pressed to her lips. Ethan watched Iris for a week. Then he started keeping track. The frequency of her coughing, the duration of each fit, the intervals between workouts. If she kept up that intensity, her lungs would fail in 2 years, maybe sooner. And no one around her was doing anything about it. Because she was a Valemore. Her destiny was to die loudly, beautifully, on the front lines, for the family's glory. Ethan thought about it for 3 days. Then he went to Minju's smithy. He asked for a thin copper tube. Minju asked what it was for. Ethan said it was for a device. Minju raised an eyebrow and forged the tube that evening. Ethan took the tube. He filled it with crushed charcoal from the forge. He inserted plugs made of thick fabric into both ends. The result was a mouthpiece with a charcoal filter. Primitive, rough, but it worked. The charcoal absorbs particles from the air. If you breathe through the mouthpiece after training, your lungs get clean air. It's not a cure, but it slows things down. Ethan waited until evening. He found a moment when Iris was walking from the training hall to the senior wing of the dormitory. He approached her. He bowed. She looked down at him. Even with a blank expression on her face, she looked as if the world existed solely to disappoint her. Ethan held out the mouthpiece. He said it was for breathing. He said it was just an interesting gadget and that she should try it after practice. Iris looked at him for 5 seconds, then at the mouthpiece, then back at him. She asked who he was. Ethan answered, an archer, F rank, basement. Iris picked up the mouthpiece with 2 fingers, as if she were picking up a dirty rag. She turned it over. She sniffed it. She nodded, and she walked away without saying another word. Ethan didn't know if she used it. He didn't check. It wasn't his business. He was an F rank in the basement. She was an A rank in the upper wing. Between them lay a chasm as deep as the world itself. But 3 days later, he noticed something. Iris wasn't coughing after practice. She was standing against the wall, her back turned to everyone, pressing something coppery to her lips. She was breathing slowly, steadily, deeply, for the first time in a long while. Then she tucked the mouthpiece into her sleeve, next to her handkerchief, and she left. Her back straight, her stride steady. But something in her gait had changed, something almost imperceptible, as if it had become a little easier for her to carry herself. Ethan made a mental note. The frequency of her coughing had dropped from 12 times a day to 4. The filter is working. The charcoal needs to be replaced every 3 days. He'll make 2 more mouthpieces, in case the first one breaks, in case she loses it, in case she throws it away because an F-rank boy shouldn't be giving gifts to the Duke's daughter. But she didn't throw it away. By the 4th month, the basement had changed. Not the walls, not the beds, not the musty smell that hadn't gone anywhere. The people had changed. Minjun stopped gasping for breath at night, not because his asthma had gone away, because Ethan had carved him an inhaler out of corkwood, complete with a chamber for dried herbs, mint and eucalyptus. Minjun breathed through the tube before bed, and the whistling in his chest subsided for the whole night. He didn't ask how Ethan knew about the herbs. He just nodded at him every morning, briefly, silently, like a man who understands that he's been given the gift of a good night's sleep, and that's more precious than gold. Claire stopped being afraid of the sessions. The lavender mask became part of her uniform. Other healers began asking where she'd gotten it. Claire replied that she'd made it herself. No one checked. She walked through the basement with a newfound confidence in her shoulders. Not loud, quiet. Like someone who'd realized for the first time that their weakness could be circumvented rather than endured. Soyeon, she went down to the basement every evening. Technically, she lived on the 1st floor in the D-rank wing, but every evening she would go down to them and sit on the steps by the entrance, bow on her lap, eyes on the door. She wasn't waiting for Ethan. She was waiting for silence. It was noisy upstairs. It was quiet here. And here he was, the one who never asked how she was doing, never offered comfort. He simply appeared one day with a bow that took away her trembling, and that was worth more than all the words in the world. Ethan noticed everything. He noticed how Minjun began to hold his sword more confidently during training because he was getting a good night's sleep. He noticed how Claire started laughing louder. He noticed how So-yeon stopped pursing her lips when she walked past the upperclassmen. Small changes, almost invisible, but to him, each one was like an entry in a ballistic table, a data point, confirmation that the calculation was correct. The 4th month brought a new problem. Her name was Ji-yoon Lee, 14 years old, the youngest in the class, D-rank scout, small, slender, with huge eyes and a polite smile that never faded. Officially, she was a messenger between the academy's wings. She delivered notes from instructors, passed along schedules, ran around with bags. Unofficially, she was the eyes and ears of the entire lower floor, because Ji-yoon heard everything. Her scout ability gave her hearing that reached a kilometer away. She could hear conversations in the principal's office while sitting in the basement. She could hear the patrol's footsteps through 3 walls. She could hear a mouse gnawing on grain in the pantry at the other end of the building. And it was precisely this hearing that was killing her, because it never turned off. Ever. During the day, she lived amid a constant din. Every step taken by every person in the academy sounded like a hammer blow. Every conversation entered her ears like a scream. At night, it was worse. When everything fell silent, she could hear people's heartbeats behind the walls, snoring, deep-breathing, the creaking of cots, the distant howling of the beasts beyond the wall. She hadn't slept properly in 5 years. Ethan found out about it by accident. He was carrying arrows from the forge across the courtyard when he saw her. She was sitting against the wall, holding her head. Her face was ashen from lack of sleep. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were pressed together. He approached and asked if everything was all right. She lifted her head and smiled, politely as usual, and said yes. Everything's fine, just a headache. Ethan looked at her and realized she was lying. Not because of her face, because of her hands. She was pressing her palms against her ears, not against her temples, against her ears. He asked what was causing the pain. She hesitated. Then she said quietly that it was the sounds. That she hears too much. That she can't turn it off. Ethan sat down next to her. He asked which frequencies were the worst. She didn't understand the word frequencies. He rephrased the question. He asked what bothered her the most. High-pitched sounds or low-pitched ones? Voices or contestants? She thought for a moment and said voices. Human whispers were the worst, because her brain automatically tried to make out the words, and that made her head split open. Ethan nodded. He stood up. He said he'd think about it. Jian looked at him with the expression of a child who'd been promised candy, at once skeptical and wistful. Ethan thought about it for 2 days. The problem was an interesting one. She didn't need complete earplugs. Complete silence is worse for a scout than noise. She had to be able to hear, but not everything. She needed a filter, one that lets useful sounds through and blocks out the useless ones. Human whispers are frequencies ranging from 200 to 400 Hz in the lower register and from 2 to 4,000 in the upper register. The creature's footsteps are low frequencies below 100 Hz. Growls and howls are also low. If she made an earplug that blocked mid-range frequencies but let the low ones through, Jian would no longer hear whispers but would continue to hear footsteps and growls. He went to the smithy. He asked Minju for 2 small copper cylinders. Minju asked what he needed them for this time. Ethan said they were for earplugs. Minju looked at him as if he were crazy, but she forged them. Ethan took the cylinders. He filled them with cork impregnated with wax to a specific density. Density was the key. Cork that was too loose would let everything through. Cork that was too dense would muffle everything. He needed cork that resonated at mid-range frequencies and dampened them, while letting the low frequencies pass through. He spent the night experimenting. He tapped on the wall and listened to how the sound passed through the earplug. He adjusted the density. He added wax. He removed some. By dawn, he had 2 earplugs that muffled voices but let through the tapping and humming. Not perfect, rough, but good enough for a start. He found Jiun in the morning. He handed her the earplugs. He explained that she should put them in her ears, that they would block out voices but let footsteps and low sounds through. He told her to try sleeping with them in. Jiun took the earplugs. She twirled them between her fingers. She looked at him with her huge eyes and said nothing. She just nodded and ran off. Ethan didn't see her that evening, or that night either. In the morning, Jiun appeared in the basement. Her face looked different, not gray, pink. Her eyes weren't red, they were clear. She walked over to Ethan, stood in front of him, and said she'd slept for 8 hours, for the first time in 5 years. 8 hours without a ringing in her head, without other people's voices, without the creaking of beds behind the walls, just silence. Her voice trembled, not from weakness, because she didn't know how to say thank you for something for which no amount of thanks is ever enough. Ethan nodded and said that if her earplugs got soggy from sweat, she should come to him. He'd make her new ones. Jiun nodded. Then she turned and left. 3 days later, Ethan found out something. Jiun came to see him after dinner and quietly said she needed to tell him something. She said she'd overheard a conversation, not on purpose. She could hear less now, but still enough. The conversation was between two senior students from the A-rank wing. They were talking about how someone from the basement was going to the training ground at night, that the guard on duty had seen a shadow, that they needed to report it. Ethan froze. Then he slowly nodded. He thanked her. Ji-yoon looked at him and said she didn't know what he was doing at night, but whatever it was, she wouldn't tell anyone, never. And if he wanted, she could be his ears. Ethan looked at the 14-year-old girl with huge eyes and earplugs made of cork and copper in her pocket. She was offering him something he hadn't asked for. Loyalty. Quiet and unconditional. He nodded. From that day on, Ji-yoon became his eyes and ears at the academy. She heard when patrols were approaching the firing range and warned him. She heard when instructors discussed rankings and relayed the information. She heard when someone spoke about Ethan and memorized every word. The 4th month was drawing to a close. The range was 360 meters. Ethan now shot only on silent nights when Ji-yoon confirmed that the range was clear. Less often than before, but more effectively. Every shot was calculated. Every adjustment was recorded. Every arrow flew exactly where he wanted it to. He began shooting over the wall. The first shot beyond the academy's boundaries was fired in the 3rd week of the 4th month. The arrow flew over the 12-meter-high wall, arced over the trees, and embedded itself in the hillside 400 meters from the range. Anton stood and listened. Silence. No screams, no alarm. The arrow vanished into the darkness. He noted the angle, the wind speed, the height of the arc, and he shot again. By the end of the 4th month, he was consistently landing arrows on the hillside beyond the wall, 400 meters, every time right on the same spot, give or take 20 centimeters, with whims up to 5 meters per second. He began to think about the 5th month, about what would happen when the range reached 500, 600, a kilometer, and about what lay beyond the hill, beyond the forest, beyond the plain, where the beasts roam far off. The bonehounds. They emerged from the rift north of the academy and sometimes made it to the surrounding villages. Last month, 2 peasants were killed. The academy sent a squad of senior cadets on a mop-up mission. They returned a week later, with casualties. 1 B-rank cadet was killed, 2 were wounded, 7 beasts were destroyed. Ethan listened to the report at the roll call and did the math. 7 beasts, 1 week, 1 casualty. If he could shoot a kilometer away, he could kill them all without leaving the academy. In a single night, with no casualties. The thought was cold and precise. Like all his thoughts, he's no hero, no savior, he's an engineer. And his engineer's mind told him that range isn't just a number in a system window. It's lives. Every meter of range is 1 person who won't have to go into battle. Every kilometer is a village that won't be burned down. He lay down on his bunk. He closed his eyes. In the corner of his vision, a number glowed faintly. 382 meters. He thought of 1,000 meters, of 10,000, about 100. About the day when his arrow would reach the horizon, and beyond. Then he rolled onto his side and fell asleep. For the first time in a long while, he didn't dream of Alabama. He dreamed of the firing range, the bowstring, and the quiet chime of the system window counting down the centimeters. 1 by 1, Weaver. The 5th month began with blood. Not his. A patrol of 4 B-rank cadets returned from a night watch beyond the wall. 3 were walking on their own. The 4th was being carried. A bonehound had sunk its teeth into his leg and kept tearing at it until the others had slain the beast with their swords. His leg was in bad shape. Claire ran to the infirmary to help. She returned an hour later, pale-faced but without nausea. The mask was working. She said the cadet would survive but wouldn't be able to walk for quite some time. Ethan listened and took stock. A bonehound, an E-rank creature, the smallest of those that crawl out of the rift. If 4 B-ranks could barely handle 1, it means it's not about strength. The thing is, hounds are fast. 2 leaps per second, unpredictable trajectory. Hitting it with a sword is like swatting a fly with a fork. An arrow is easier if you know where it's going to leap. And Ethan knew. Because any trajectory is a pattern, even for a living creature. A hound leaps at its prey, so its final landing point is the target. The direction of the leap is determined by the prey's position. If you know where the prey is standing, you know where the hound will leap. Anticipation. Ballistics of anticipation. He used to calculate missile trajectories in his past life. A living creature isn't more complex than a winged missile with random maneuvers. It's simpler, because a missile has an engine while a hound has only muscles. Muscles are predictable. That night, he went over the wall, for the first time, not through the gate. Through a gap in the drainage grate at the eastern corner that Ji-eun had found a week ago. She'd said the grate was rusty and the bars could be pried apart by hand. Ethan pried them apart. He squeezed through. He found himself outside. A hill, a forest, darkness. The moon hidden behind the clouds. He climbed to the top of the hill, the very one he'd been shooting at from the firing range. He found his arrows on the slope, 14 of them, all intact. He gathered them up, sat down on a rock, and began to listen. Silence. The wind, the rustling of leaves, a distant howl. The rift was to the north. According to the map he'd traced from the library, it was about 30 kilometers away. His effective range was 410 meters, not even close. But he hadn't come here to shoot at the rift. He'd come to scope out the terrain, to memorize the terrain, to memorize the distances, to memorize the landmarks. That rock over there at the edge of the forest, 420 meters. That dry tree on the ridge, 510. That cliff beyond the ravine, 600. I won't be able to reach it yet. I'll reach it in a month. He sat on the hill for an hour. He wrote everything down. He returned to the academy through the pass. He went to sleep. In the morning, it was business as usual. Training, misses, apologies, a C in the logbook. The 6th month brought a range of over 600 meters. Ethan was now shooting from the top of the hill, every third night. The rest of the nights he spent at the range building up his volume. 1,000 shots a night, sometimes 1,500. His hands had gotten used to it. The calluses had become as tough as the leather of gloves. His shoulder moved smoothly. The U-bow sang. Every shot was clean. Every centimeter went toward his goal. In the 2nd week of the 6th month, he shot at a live target for the first time. A hound. A lone dog. She was scurrying along the edge of the forest 700 meters from the hill. Ethan lay on his stomach on the ridge. The wind was blowing from the west at 4 meters per second. Humidity was high. The temperature was around 8 degrees. Air density was 1.24 kilograms per cubic meter. He did the math in his head. The flight time of the arrow over 700 meters at an initial velocity of 62 meters per is approximately 14 seconds, taking deceleration into account. In 14 seconds, the hound will run about 80 meters. Lead, 80 meters ahead in the direction of travel. Wind correction, 6 meters to the left. Target elevation correction, -3 degrees. Ethan raised his bow. He drew the string. He held his breath. He released. The arrow vanished into the darkness. Silence. 14 seconds is a very long time when you're waiting. 1, 2, 3. He counted and listened. At the 13th second, a short shriek rang out far below. Then silence. Ethan lay on a rock and stared into the darkness. He couldn't see the body. It was too far away. But the shriek was short. That meant a clean hit. The brain stem or the neck. Instant death. He lay there, breathing. His hands didn't tremble. His heart beat steadily. But something inside him had shifted. Not fear, not joy. Realization. He had just killed a living creature. A beast, perhaps. One from the rift, perhaps. But alive. A creature that was breathing and running, unaware that an arrow was flying out of the darkness to kill it in 14 seconds. Ethan lay on the hill until dawn. Then he went down. He found the hound, dead. The arrow had entered the base of the skull, right into the brainstem. He pulled the arrow out, examined the tip. Intact. 3 edges had entered and exited cleanly. Good work, Minju. A core glowed dimly next to the body. Small, cloudy, E-rank. Ethan picked it up. His first trophy. He returned to the academy and hid the core under his bunk. He didn't tell anyone. That night, he sat on the basement roof and looked at the stars. He thought that his first kill should feel different, more terrifying, or more solemn. But he felt only exhaustion and a quiet certainty that his calculations had been correct. 14 seconds, 80 meters lead. Hit. The formula works. The world is no different from the firing range. Only the targets are alive. In the morning, he went to help Claire make ointments. She asked why he had dark circles under his eyes. He said he hadn't slept well. She didn't believe him but didn't press the issue. The 7th month. The range had surpassed 1 kilometer, 1,100 meters. Ethan stood on the hill and looked out at the forest. The forest stretched to the horizon. Beyond the forest lay a plain. Beyond the plain lay mountains. Beyond the mountains lay the rift. His arrow now reached the far edge of the forest, over the treetops, in an arc. 4 kilometers along a parabolic path, giving him some leeway, but accuracy dropped at such distances. The wind shifted several times along the flight path. The arrow flew for 30 seconds, and during that time, conditions changed twice. Ethan began to construct a multi-layered model in his head. Layer 1, the wind at the point of release. Layer 2, the wind at the height of the arc. Layer 3, wind at the target. 3 different vectors, 3 different adjustments, plus changes in air density with altitude, plus the temperature gradient. At his old job, they used a computer for such calculations. Here, his brain was the computer. He calculated in his head, faster than he'd expected. The body of a 15-year-old teenager gave him something he hadn't had in his previous life: speed of thought. His young brain processed numbers at breakneck speed. It was as if the system had given him not only a bow, but also a processor in his head. Perhaps that was exactly what had happened. By the 8th month, he had killed another 4 hounds, all at night, all from the hill, all with a single shot. The bullets lay under the cot in a rag bag, 5 of them, small ones, almost useless. But Ethan didn't throw them away. Each bullet was proof that his formulas worked. The 8th month brought something new: rumors. At roll call, they announced that cases of creatures dying for no apparent reason had been reported in the vicinity of the academy. 3 hounds and 2 small wyverns had been found dead with clean wounds from an unknown weapon. Command was concerned. Perhaps a lone hunter was operating in the woods, or a group. The academy was stepping up patrols. Ethan stood in formation and listened. His face was impassive. His back was hunched. His hands were behind his back. A typical posture for an F-rank underachiever. Minjun stood nearby, coughing into his fist. Behind him was Claire, with a mask hanging from her neck. Soyeon stood 3 rows ahead in the D-rank formation. Jiyun sat on the edge of the bleachers, swinging her legs. Hannah stood with the instructors, staring straight ahead. Not at Ethan. Past him. Deliberately past him. Ethan returned to the basement after roll call. He sat down on his bunk. He thought. The 5 beasts. They'd noticed. He'd been careless. He'd shot the wyverns during the day. He'd taken the risk because one of them was circling too close to the wall, and he'd feared it would attack the sentries. The arrow had left the training ground through a loophole in the eastern wall. No one saw the shot, but the wyvern fell in a field a kilometer from the academy, with a triangular arrowhead in its neck. The same arrowheads he'd ordered from Minju. If someone pulled the arrow from its body and brought it to the academy, and if someone connected the unusual arrowhead to the blacksmith's orders. Ethan stood up. He walked over to Minju. She was working at the forge. The hammer struck steadily. Sparks flew. Ethan waited until she was finished. Then he asked to speak with her. Minju wiped her hands on her apron and nodded. Ethan said he needed arrowheads of a different shape. The usual ones, triangular ones, like everyone else's. Minju frowned. She asked why. The triangular ones worked better. Ethan said that was exactly why. They worked too well. They stood out too much. Minju looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was strange. Ethan agreed. Minju forged 30 regular arrowheads for him by evening. Ethan reassembled all his arrows overnight. He hid the triangular arrowheads in a cache on the hill under a rock. Now his arrows looked like any hunter's. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable. The 9th month. Range, 4 kilometers, 4,000 meters. The arrow flew for over a minute. At such distances, Ethan only shot at stationary targets, trees, rocks, cliffs. His accuracy dropped, but he compensated with calculations. Every shot took 5 minutes of calculations. The 10th month began with a visit. An investigator from the Church of the 5 Faces. A tall man in white robes with a silver star on his chest. He arrived in the morning on a white horse and walked into the academy as if he were at home. At roll call, the director announced that Holy Inquisitor Revos had arrived for an inspection. He would be examining every cadet. Personally, Ethan stood in formation and felt a cold knot tighten inside him. The Inquisitors were looking for magical anomalies, hidden classes, secret abilities. If Revos checked his system window, he'd see trajectory accumulation. He'd see the range figures. He'd see that an F-rank archer could shoot 4 kilometers. And then it would all be over. The inspection began with the top wing, A ranks, B ranks. Iris stood before Revos and stared into his eyes without blinking. He ran his hand over her head. The silver star on his chest flickered dimly. He nodded and let go. Then the C ranks, D ranks. So-yeon passed the inspection without question. Revos barely glanced at her. Then the E ranks. Claire removed her mask and stood there, pale but composed. Revos jotted something down in his log and walked past. Then the F ranks, the basement. Ethan waited for his turn and thought. Trajectory accumulation is a passive ability. It doesn't emit mana. He has 1 mana point. His magical background is 0. The investigator searches for magical anomalies. But his ability isn't magical, it's physical. Every shot adds a centimeter. Not with mana, not with a spell. A system entry, like a line in a database. Revos could see his class and rank, but would he see the numbers? Ethan didn't know, and that was frightening. His turn had come. Revos stood before him, tall, thin, eyes so light they were almost transparent. He looked down at Ethan. He ran his hand over his head. A silver star flickered, faintly, barely noticeable. Revos frowned. He ran his hand over his head again. The star flickered just as faintly. He looked Ethan in the eyes. He asked his name. Ethan answered. Revos asked his class. Ethan said Archer, F rank. Revos looked at his wooden bow, at his rumpled uniform, at his thin arms, at the calluses that could be mistaken for those from hard labor rather than from thousands of shots. Revos asked what special ability he had in his window. Ethan answered. Trajectory accumulation. Revos raised an eyebrow. He asked what that meant. Ethan said that each shot he fired added a small increment to his range. Very small. 1 centimeter. Revos was silent for a moment. Then he said that a centimeter was nothing. Ethan nodded and said yes, exactly, nothing. Revos looked at him for another second. Then he jotted something down in his logbook and walked on. Ethan stood there, breathing, evenly, slowly, like after a shot. Revos didn't see the numbers. He saw the class. He saw the rank. He saw the special ability. But he didn't see how many centimeters had been accumulated. Because this isn't magic, it's statistics. And investigators aren't looking for statistics. They're looking for mana. That evening, Ethan sat on the roof of the basement. Ji-eun sat beside him. She'd come with information. After his inspection, Revos had spoken with the director. Ji-eun had heard every word. Revos said he hadn't found any hidden S ranks among the cadets. He said everyone's magical background was within normal limits, but he added that the deaths of beasts in the surrounding area were troubling him. He said that if the culprit wasn't found within a year, the church would declare a holy inquisition. The director replied that he would do everything possible. Revos left the next morning. Ethan sighed. A year. He had a year, maybe less. Ji-eun said something else. A senior student from the A rank wing had come to the basement last week. Polite, smiling. He asked who was going to the training ground at night. He questioned Min-jun. Min-jun replied that he didn't know. Claire said the same thing. The senior student smiled and laughed. Ji-eun recognized him. He was Sir Cassian Valemore's personal assistant. Ethan listened and nodded. Cassian, the Duke's heir. The very same man who had sat in the stands and smirked when So-yeon missed her mark. Now he was sending people to the basement to ask questions. Why? What is he looking for? The answer came a week later. At the General Assembly, the director announced that House Valemore had established a reward. 10,000 gold pieces for information on the unknown hunter who was killing beasts in the vicinity of the academy, and 20,000 for his capture alive. The director read the announcement in a flat voice. Cassian stood beside him and smiled. Handsome, confident, in expensive armor bearing the Valemore crest on his chest. He scanned the ranks of cadets, slowly, appraisingly, like a man searching for something and knowing it's somewhere here. Ethan stood staring at the floor. F rank. Quiet. Inconspicuous. A wooden bow on his back. A U bow hidden under his bunk. In class, only the wooden one. Always. Cassian walked past the line of F ranks without even glancing at them. He was interested in B ranks and above. Who else could kill the beasts from a distance? F rank. Ridiculous. The 11th month. Range, 10 kilometers. The arrow flew for more than 3 minutes. At such distances, Accuracy depended on dozens of variables that Ethan kept in his head simultaneously. Wind at 5 altitudes, temperature gradient, humidity, air pressure, the Coriolis effect, the curvature of the Earth's surface. Yes, at 10 kilometers, the curvature of the Earth's surface began to play a role. The target was hidden beyond the horizon. The arrow followed a parabolic trajectory that had to account for the fact that the Earth wasn't flat. Ethan recalled how, in his past life, he had solved this problem for artillery shells. The same equations, the same corrections. Only instead of a computer, it was his brain. And his brain was up to the task. He began hunting systematically, not just when the need arose, but according to a plan. Ji-yoon listened to patrol reports on the creature's movements and relayed them to Ethan. He plotted the data on a map he'd redrawn from the library and supplemented it with his own observations: the hound's routes, the wyvern's nests, the trails to watering holes. He knew where the beasts would be tomorrow, and he shot there today. After 2 weeks of systematic hunting, the tally had risen to 23 beasts killed, all E rank, all with a single shot, all at night. He stowed the projectiles in a bag under his bunk. The bag was getting heavier. Ethan wondered what to do with them. He couldn't sell them. They'd ask where they came from. It seemed a waste to throw them away. The energy in the cores was valuable. Maybe they'd come in handy someday. He decided to keep hoarding them for now. Toward the end of the 11th month, something happened that he hadn't planned on. Night. A hill. A north wind blowing at 6 meters per second. Ethan lay on the ridge, scanning for targets. Ji-yoon said that a patrol had reported a pack of 5 hounds moving south toward the village of Volkova. The village was 8 kilometers from the academy. Ethan raised his scope. He found the pack. 5 shadows glided across the moonlit field, quickly, heading toward the village. If he didn't stop them, they'd be there in an hour. There were 40 people in the village, not a single fighter, just peasants. Ethan counted. 5 targets, moving, different speeds, different directions. He could kill one. By the time he reloaded, the rest would be gone. He needed 5 shots, 5 calculations, 5 hits. And all this while the pack crosses the open field, about 4 minutes. He started shooting. The first arrow flew. Reload. Calculation. The second. Reload. Calculation. The third. The fourth. The fifth. 5 arrows in the air, each on its own arc, each with a different lead, each flying toward its target. Ethan lay there and listened. 1 minute, 2, a distant yelp, another, silence, then another yelp, and silence. 4 out of 5, 1 missed. Either the arrow flew past or the hound dodged it. 4 out of 5, 80% at 8 kilometers against moving targets at night with a wind of 6 meters per second. Ethan lay there, breathing. His hands were shaking, not from fatigue, from adrenaline. 4 out of 5. The village of Volkova sleeps, unaware that it has just survived. He lay on the cold stone and looked up at the stars, and he thought that 4 out of 5 wasn't enough. 1 miss meant someone's death. He needed 5 out of 5. He needed to aim more accurately. He needed to shoot faster. He needed more data. Always more data. He returned to the basement before dawn. He lay down on his cot. He closed his eyes. Numbers swirled in his head. Adjustments, trajectories, speeds, formulas. He fell asleep with them and woke up with them. They wouldn't go away. They had become a part of him, like calluses on his fingers, like the habit of breathing steadily before a shot, like a quiet voice in his head that calculated the distance to every target he saw. 480 meters to the grandstand, 700 to the edge of the forest, 10,000 to the horizon, further, always further. The 12th month, a year at the academy, a range of 30 kilometers, 30,000 meters. The arrow flew for more than 10 minutes. At such distances, Ethan shot blind. He couldn't see the target. He couldn't see it. The horizon hid everything beyond 5 kilometers. But he didn't need to see. He needed to know. Maps, patrol reports, Ji-yoon's data, the beast's routes, which he had studied for months. He knew that every Tuesday a flock of wyverns flew over the pass 27 kilometers to the north. He knew that the ash serpent crawled out of a crevice in the mountains every new moon and slithered toward the river. He knew the beast's schedules as well as he had known the train schedules in his past life, and he fired according to schedule. The ash serpent became his first major target. A B-rank beast, 12 meters long, armored scales, a venomous tail. A squad of 6 B-rank hunters had died trying to kill one last year. Ethan found its lair on the map, a crevice in the mountains 31 kilometers from the hill. The serpent slithered out at night, always along the same trail. Habit. Beasts have habits too. Ethan waited for the new moon. He went out onto the hill. He lay down on the ridge. The wind was blowing from the northwest at 5 meters per second. The temperature was 4 degrees. The pressure was high. The air was thick. Good. Dense air stabilizes the arrow on a long arc. He counted 8 minutes. Coriolis correction. 31 kilometers, 2 meters, 40 centimeters. Surface curvature, 75 meters of drop. The arrow should rise 4 kilometers at its apogee and fall precisely into the crevice. Elevation angle, 38 degrees. He raised the bow. He drew the string to its limit. The U-bow creaked. It held. Ethan held his breath. He released. The arrow soared into the sky. Vertically, almost. It rose and vanished into the darkness. Ethan lay there counting the seconds. 10. 20, 30, 1 minute, 2, 5, 8. At 9 minutes and 14 seconds, a sound rang out far beyond the mountains. Not a screech, a roar, short, abrupt, and silence. Ethan closed his eyes. A message flashed in the system window. Damage dealt. Target destroyed. Rank B. Plus 12 points to total damage. He opened his eyes. He looked at his hands. Unshaken. He had just killed a rank B beast, with a single shot, from a distance of 31 kilometers, without leaving the Academy's line of sight. The ash serpent. The very type of creature that had wiped out squads of 6 men. Dead. An arrow to the brain stem, or to the base of the skull, or wherever it hit. It didn't matter. Dead. Ethan lay on the rock and realized he'd crossed the line. Hounds were small fry. Cadets killed them during mop-up operations. A rank B serpent was another matter. People would notice. There would be an investigation. It would raise questions with no answers. He was right. 3 days later, the news spread throughout the Academy. A patrol had found a dead ash snake in a crevice near the northern mountains. Killed with a single blow. Weapon unknown. The wound was clean, deep. A through-and-through wound. No traces of magic, no fingerprints, no witnesses. A B-rank creature killed by an unknown assailant. Royal Intelligence received the report that same day. A week later, a second visitor arrived at the Academy. Not an investigator, a Royal Intelligence officer. A quiet man in plain clothes who spoke to everyone and was forgotten by everyone. Ji-yoon spotted him on the very first day. She told Ethan that the officer was questioning the instructors about cadets with unusual abilities. So far, he'd focused on B ranks and above. He hadn't made it to the basement, for now. Ethan nodded and continued whittling his arrow. So-yoon came to the basement that evening. She sat on the steps next to the door and sat there in silence for 10 minutes. Then she said she'd heard about the snake. She said everyone was saying it was done by a hidden S rank. Someone was hiding in the mountains. Maybe a former soldier. Maybe a hermit. She looked at Ethan. He was whittling an arrow and didn't look up. She asked what he thought. Ethan said it was probably a hermit. That happens. Strong people go into the mountains. So-yoon nodded. She was silent for a moment. Then she said that the serpent had been killed by a single arrow. Not a sword, not magic, an arrow. Ethan stopped whittling. He looked at her. She was looking at him, quietly, seriously. There was no accusation in her eyes, no fear. There was a question, just one. She didn't ask it. She stood up. She took the bow from his cot, the weighted one. She ran her fingers along the leather rest. She put it back, and she left. Ethan sat there, watching her go. She knew, or at least suspected, and she remained silent. So-yeon Han, the girl with the trembling hands for whom he'd carved a bow to steady her tremors. She didn't ask the question because the answer would mean she'd have to do something about it. And she didn't want to do anything. She wanted him to keep going. The first year was coming to an end. Exams, grades, rankings. Ethan passed all his exams exactly as required. A C in marksmanship, a C in tactics, a B in survival because he was really good at tying knots and building a fire. The instructors shook their heads. F rank. What can you expect from him? Hannah gave him a C in marksmanship and underlined the word perseverance in the comments section. So-yeon received the highest score. The first D-rank cadet in history to score a 10 out of 10 on the first-year final exam. The instructors were surprised. So-yeon wasn't surprised. She knew that every shot she fired flew straight, precisely because she held a bow that someone had spent nights calculating. Claire passed all her practical exams. No fainting spells, no nausea, with her mask on. She was admitted to her second year. For the first time in the Academy's history, an E-rank healer with a fear of blood had completed her first year without a single failure. Min-jun didn't drop his sword even once during the entire exam period. His breathing was steady, his hands were steady, his gloves were intact. He received a C, but a genuine, honest C, which meant he could continue. Ji-yoon spent the entire exam period running around with notes and pretending she was just a messenger. But every evening, she brought Ethan the patrol schedule for the next day. The creature's routes, the instructor's conversations. She knew everything about him, and she kept quiet, with a smile, with politeness, with a devotion that sometimes made Ethan's throat tighten. She's 14 years old. She should be thinking about dresses and sweets. Instead, she was his eyes and ears, his shield of information. Because he'd given her earplugs made of cork and copper, and for the first time in 5 years, she'd slept through the night. The end of the first year. Ethan lay on a cot in the basement. Min-jun was asleep. Claire was asleep. The moon shone through the small window near the ceiling. Range, 30 kilometers. The second year began with changes. The basement remained the same. Dampness, low ceiling, cots. But the people inside had changed. Min-jun had grown stronger. His asthma hadn't gone away, but the herbal inhaler gave him 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep every night. He had gained weight. His shoulders had broadened. During training, he no longer gasped for breath after the first sparring session. For the first time, the sword instructor said he might amount to something. Claire had become more confident. The mask had become part of her image. Other healers began to imitate her. Some wore masks with mint, others with sage. Claire watched them and grinned. She started joking more often, louder. Her laughter rang through the basement like a bell. So-yeon moved from the D-rank wing to temporary housing between floors. Technically, it was a promotion, a room for 2 instead of the common hall. But every evening she went down to the basement. She'd sit on the steps, her bow on her lap. Sometimes she was silent. Sometimes she chatted with Claire about trivial things. Sometimes she just watched Ethan whittle arrows. Ji-yin had grown 2 centimeters. Ethan noticed because he'd measured the height of her ears from the ground to calibrate her earplugs. She laughed when he said she needed new ones. She asked if 2 centimeters really changed the frequency. Ethan replied that it didn't, but he took the opportunity to improve the cork filling. The new earplugs muffled voices by 90%. Ji-yeon slept like a baby, and during the day she could hear the patrol's footsteps outside the 4 walls. Iris became an enigma. After the mouthpiece with the charcoal filter, her cough decreased 4-fold. She still didn't speak to Ethan. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge his existence. But every 3 days, a copper appeared at the basement door. No note, no words. Just a filter packed with charcoal that needed replacing. Ethan would change the charcoal. He'd leave the mouthpiece at the entrance to the upper wing. In the morning, it would disappear. This went on for 3 months, a silent ritual. The copper tube traveled between the basement and the upper wing like a letter with no address. Cassian didn't leave. He stayed at the academy for a second year as an observer from House Valamore, officially to support his younger sister. Unofficially, everyone knew he was looking for the unknown archer. His people questioned the cadets. They checked the forge. They counted the arrows in the storerooms. Minju told Ethan that people had come to her asking who was ordering arrowheads. She replied that everyone was ordering them. Hundreds of cadets, thousands of arrowheads. Try counting them. They left empty-handed, but Ethan knew it wouldn't last long. Cassian was smart, patient, and convinced that an S rank was hiding somewhere within the walls of his academy. The range was increasing, 180 kilometers by the middle of the second year. An arrow flew for 20 minutes. At such distances, Ethan only shot at stationary targets, wyvern nests, beast lairs, clusters near the faults. He studied maps for hours, calculated coordinates using triangulation, used Jian's data and patrol reports, and he fired. Once every 2 or 3 days. 1 shot, 1 target, 1 hit. The beast count had surpassed 100. Royal intelligence was going crazy. Reports were coming in from all over the borderlands. Beasts were being found dead in the most unexpected places. In the mountains, in the forests, on the plains. Everywhere, the same thing. A clean wound. No traces. No magic. The capital's newspapers wrote about the angel, the guardian of the borderlands. The church declared it a sign from Asteria. Some of the peasants began setting up small altars in honor of the unknown defender. Ethan read about it in the library and shook his head. An angel. A sign. He's an engineer with a wooden bow who calculates the Coriolis correction in his head. On the 15th month, a turning point occurred. The fissure north of the academy widened. A wave of beasts surged out of it. Not hounds, not wyverns. A bone titan, an A-rank beast, 15 meters tall, an armored skeleton of black bone, eyes like braziers. Every step left a crater in the ground. The academy ordered the evacuation of the surrounding villages. 3 A-rank squads set out to intercept it. Cassian led one of them personally. Handsome, in gleaming armor, with a sword that cost more than the entire basement had in 10 years. Ethan stood on the basement roof and watched as the squads headed north. Min-jun and Claire stood nearby. So-yun stood a little further away. Ji-eun sat on the edge of the roof and listened. Ethan asked Ji-eun how far it was to Titan. She closed her eyes. She concentrated. She said she could hear heavy footsteps. Far away. Very far away. Heading north, northeast. Ethan pulled out a map. He estimated the distance. 25 kilometers. Within the impact zone. He looked at the team. They were looking at him. Min-jun, Claire, So-yun, Ji-eun. 4 pairs of eyes. So-yun said she knew. Claire said she'd figured it out a long time ago. Min-jun said he wasn't an idiot and that his blood-stained fingers every morning weren't from gardening. Ji-eun said nothing. She had known longer than anyone. Ethan stood there and looked at them. 4 people the system had written off as waste. F ranks, E ranks, D ranks. His team. A team that had remained silent for months. A team that had covered for him. A team that hadn't asked any questions. He nodded. He pulled a U-bow from under his bunk. He went out onto the roof. North wind, 7 meters per second. Temperature, 6 degrees. Pressure dropping. Low cloud cover. 25 kilometers. An A-rank bone titan. An armored skeleton. Vulnerable spot, the brain node at the base of the skull. According to the textbooks, the node measures 10 centimeters. 10 centimeters at 25 kilometers. A shot at a coin from another city. Ethan counted down 3 minutes. So-yun stood nearby, silently holding the quiver. Claire stood behind him. Min-jun blocked the ladder to the roof so no one could climb up. Ji-eun listened. Ethan raised his bow. He drew it back. The bowstring dug into his fingers. His calluses held up. He aimed at the sky. Elevation angle, 36 degrees. Wind correction, 12 meters to the right. Coriolis effect, 1 meter 70 to the left. Curvature of the Earth's surface, 49 meters of drop. All the numbers in his head. All at once, he exhaled. He released the string. The arrow shot upward. It vanished into the clouds. Silence. They stood on the roof and waited. 1 minute, 2, 5, 8. Ji-eun held her palms to her ears. Her earplugs were out. She was listening at full volume. At the 9-minute mark, she flinched. Her eyes widened. She said she could hear a thud. Something had fallen. Something big. The ground was rumbling. The footsteps stopped. Ethan closed his eyes. A message flashed in the system window. Damage dealt. Target destroyed. Rank A. Plus 120 points to total damage. So-yun pressed her hand to her mouth. Claire let out a quiet curse. Min-jun sat down on the floor and stared at the wall. Ji-eun smiled. Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at the U-bow, at the bowstring, at his hands, and said they needed to get off the roof before anyone came up. They climbed down, put the bow away, sat down on their bunks, and remained silent until the squads returned 3 hours later. Cassian walked through the gate, his face as white as chalk. His squad had found Titan dead. The A-rank creature lay on its side in the middle of the field. An arrow protruded from the base of its skull. An ordinary one, with a triangular tip. No traces of magic. 10 centimeters from the brainstem, a shot right in the center, from an unknown known distance. Cassian stood over the Titan's body and stared at the arrow. And in his eyes, Ethan would have seen not fear, rage. Someone had stolen his victory, his glory, his proof that he was worthy of S-rank. Someone had accomplished with a single arrow what would have taken him an hour of battle and cost him men. Cassian pulled the arrow from Titan's skull. He examined the tip. Ordinary, triangular, like thousands of others. He clenched the arrow in his fist so hard that the shaft cracked. After the Titan's death, the academy was abuzz. Cadets were discussing it on every corner. Senior instructors were conferring behind closed doors. Cassian locked himself in his quarters and didn't come out for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he emerged, calm, composure, with a new gleam in his eyes that Ethan didn't like. Cassian gathered the senior A-rank cadets in the training hall. Ji-yoon eavesdropped. Cassian said that the unknown shooter was an archer, not a mage, not a swordsman, an archer, an ordinary arrow, a triangular arrowhead, no traces of magic. So, pure physics. That means it's someone with incredible range and accuracy. There's no one like that among the Academy's A ranks. They've all been checked. So the shooter is hiding among the lower ranks, or among the instructors. Cassian ordered a check of every cadet with the combat class of archer or marksman. Every single one, including the F ranks. Ji-yoon relayed everything to Ethan word for word. Ethan sat on his bunk and thought. Cassian had the search. An archer. That's right. It's logical. And it's dangerous. There are 17 cadets at the Academy with the Archer or Marksman class, 4 A ranks, 6 B ranks, 3 C ranks, 2 D ranks, including So-yeon, 1 E rank, and 1 F rank. Him. Cassian will start with the A ranks. He'll check their range. He won't find anything unusual. He'll move down to the B ranks, then to the C ranks, then to the D ranks. He'll get to So-yeon. He'll check. He won't find anything. He'll move on to the E ranks, then to the F ranks, to him. And then Cassian will see it. A wooden bow. A range of 24 meters according to official records. Sees in archery. Misses during training. The most pathetic archer in the Academy's history. Cassian will look at him and walk right past, because it's impossible. An F rank can't kill a titan. It's like an ant killing an elephant. Absurd. Ridiculous. Ethan was counting on that absurdity, on the impossibility that was his best defense. No one looks for the impossible. The assessment began 2 days later. Cassian was personally present at every test. Each archer stepped onto the range and shot at maximum range. The A ranks achieved distances ranging from 300 to 500 meters. Cassian nodded and moved on to the next one. B ranks shot from 150 to 300. C ranks shot from 100 to 200. So-yeon took her position. She raised her weighted bow. She shot. The arrow struck the target at 120 paces. Clean hit, right in the center. Cassian looked at her, then at the bow in her hands. He frowned. He asked where she'd gotten such a non-standard bow. So-yeon replied that she'd found it in the storeroom. Cassian turned the bow over in his hands. He looked at the weighted grip, at the leather rest, at the elm wood inlay, handcrafted, not factory-made. Someone had made this bow to fit specific hands. He asked who had made it. So-yeon said she didn't know. Cassian gave her a long, steady look. So-yeon held his gaze. Her back was straight. Her eyes were steady. Her hands didn't tremble. Cassian returned the bow and walked on. The E-rank archer shot 60 meters. Ethan went out last. A wooden bow. Not U. The U one was under the bunk. Only the wooden one was for the test. Old, warped, with a sagging bowstring. He picked up the bow, drawn it back. His hands were shaking. On purpose. He loosened his grip so the bow wobbled. He released the string. The arrow flew off and stuck into the ground 10 meters from his position. It didn't even reach half the distance to the target. One of the A ranks laughed. Cassian looked at Ethan, at the wooden bow, at the crumpled uniform, at the thin arms, and turned away. He didn't even bother to record the result. F rank, 10 meters. Ridiculous. Ethan bowed and left the range. His back was hunched. His eyes were fixed on the ground. Inside, he felt a quiet, cold satisfaction. Cassian walked past him, just as he'd expected. But So-yeon's bow had caught his attention. That was dangerous. If Cassian started digging into who made the bow for the D-rank archer, he'd trace it back to the forge, to Minju, and Minju knew too much. Ethan went to see Minju that same evening. He told her about the inspection, about Cassian's questions regarding the bow. Minju listened while standing by the forge with a hammer in her hand. Then she said that if anyone came to her, she'd say the bow had been ordered by an anonymous customer through the order box. That happens. Nobles often order weapons anonymously so as not to lose face in front of the craftsman. Ethan nodded. A good cover story. Minju looked at him and asked when he would tell her the truth. Ethan paused. Then he said, soon. Minju snorted and said he'd been saying soon for half a year now. Ethan replied that soon was a relative concept. Minju raised her hammer but didn't strike. She just grunted. Then she turned back to the anvil. The second half of the second year. Range, 400 kilometers, 400,000 meters. The arrow flew for over an hour. At such distances, the calculations took 20 minutes. Every shot was like launching a rocket. All the variables, all the wind layers, the entire curvature of the planet, the entire Coriolis effect. Ethan shot once a week. One arrow, one target. The fissures to the north, the creatures that emerged from them and headed toward the cities. He took them out one by one, patiently, methodically, like a watchmaker removing excess gears. The city of Talmer, 120 kilometers from the academy, stopped losing patrols. For the first time in 10 years, the villages on the northern plain planted crops beyond their walls. Trade caravans began traveling without escorts. No one knew why. The beasts simply stopped appearing on the roads. The roads simply became safe. Someone unseen was simply removing the threats beyond the horizon. The capital's newspapers wrote about the miracle on the borderlands. The church announced that Asteria's grace had descended upon the northern lands. Peasants set up altars. They prayed. They thanked the goddess who had finally remembered them. Ethan was reading the newspaper in the library and thinking that Asteria's grace was a yew-bow and 10,000 hours of archery practice. Then he turned the page and found an article stating that the House of Valemore had doubled the bounty for the unknown archer. 40,000 gold pieces. Alive. Ethan folded the newspaper and went to carve arrows. By the end of the second year, his range had reached 600 kilometers. The count of creatures killed had surpassed 300. Among them were 2 A-rank Titans, 1 A-rank Stormhawk, and countless smaller ones. The rifts to the north had begun to narrow, not drastically, but measurably. Patrols reported that the number of beasts emerging had decreased by a third. The Academy's scientists couldn't explain why. Ethan could. Every beast he killed was energy that didn't return to the rift. Every core in his bag under the bunk was a piece of power torn from the cycle. He was draining the rift. Slowly, arrow by arrow, centimeter by centimeter. On the basement roof, on the last evening of the second year, everyone gathered. Minjun, Claire, So-yun, Ji-yoon, and Minju, who had come up from the forge for the first time because Ethan had finally told her the truth. The whole truth. Minju listened for 10 minutes. Then she said one word. And that word was such that Claire blushed and Minjun coughed. Then Minju asked what kind of bow he needed. A real one, not a yew one, a real one. Ethan pulled out a blueprint, a composite bow, horn plates, ashwood, tendons, a Mongolian design, one that this world doesn't know. Minju looked at the blueprint and her eyes sparkled. She said she needed 3 nights. Ethan said she had a week. Minju said 3 nights, and she went into the smithy. Minju didn't sleep for 3 nights. Ethan came to the smithy every few hours and found the same scene every time. She stood at the anvil in a leather apron covered in soot, hammering away. She had carved the horn plates from the horns of a mountain goat, which she had traded to the quartermaster for a batch of ceremonial spearheads. Ethan had brought the ashwood base himself. He'd spent 3 days selecting it. He tapped each board with his knuckles and listened to the sound. The density of the wood is determined by its tone. A high-pitched ring means it's dense. A dull thud means it's loose. He needed dense wood. Ji-yoon got the tendons. She knew the butcher at the academy kitchen and bartered for mountain ox tendons in exchange for 3 notes with the patrol schedule. Notes the butcher used to hide his contraband salted meat from inspections. On the 4th morning, Minju emerged from the smithy. She was holding a bow. Ethan took it and froze. The composite bow possessed a beauty that only those who understand it can see. No decorations, no gilding. Horn plates on the inner side of the limbs, ashwood on the outer side. The tendons were stretched tight and glued in place. The grip was wrapped in 3 layers of leather, each of a different thickness. Minju remembered how he had made the bow for So-yun and repeated the technique. Ethan drew the bowstring. The draw weight was 3 times that of the yew-bow. The initial velocity of the projectile at that draw weight was approximately 90 meters per second. Compared to the previous 62, a 45% increase. All the tables need to be recalculated. All the adjustments. All the angles. He smiled. Minju looked at him and waited. Ethan said it was the best weapon he'd ever held in his hands. In both of his lives. Minju turned away, but he noticed her ears had turned red. She muttered that it was just iron and wood, nothing special. Then she added quietly that the bow had withstood twice the normal tension during testing. She'd cried when it didn't break, but she wouldn't mention that. Ethan didn't say anything about the tear stains he'd seen on her apron. That same night, he went out onto the hill with his new bow. The first shot flew like a cannonball. The arrow soared so high that it disappeared from view in half a second. Speed, power, stability, a whole new level. The range from the first shot jumped because the accumulated kilometers were multiplied by the new initial velocity. The system recalculated. A number flashed on the screen. Range, 780 kilometers. Ethan stood on the hill and stared at that number. 780. In a month, it would be 1,000. With the new bow, every shot delivered more than before. Not a centimeter, 3 centimeters. The system scaled the increase in the weapon's power. He hadn't known this before because the difference between Rain and Yu was negligible. But the compound bow had revealed a new layer of mechanics. A stronger bow, greater gains. No ceiling. He shot all night. 200 shots. By dawn, the range was 786 kilometers. 6 kilometers in one night. Before, he'd gained 2 or 3. Minju had given him more than just a weapon. She gave him a boost. The next 2 weeks brought events Ethan hadn't expected. Iris came down to the basement. For the first time, she stood in the doorway and looked at the 8 cots, at the low ceiling, at the small window near the ceiling, at the damp walls. She had never been here before. The Duke's daughter in the basement for F ranks. Claire jumped out of her bunk. Minjun's eyes widened. Ethan was sitting on the floor, whittling an arrow. He looked up. He looked at her. She looked at him. Then she pulled a mouthpiece out of her sleeve, a copper one, with a clogged filter. She placed it on his bunk and said she needed to talk. They went up to the roof. Night. Stars. A cold wind. Iris stood at the edge and looked north, toward where the rifts loomed dark beyond the mountains. She said she knew. Not everything, but enough. She said her brother Cassian was looking for the one who killed the Titan. She said Cassian was close to the answer. He'd found an arrow in the Titan's skull and given it to a master armorer in the capital. The master said the shaft was made of hazel. Hazel grows in the academy, behind the basement. Cassian will start checking who had access to the hazel, and he'll end up in the basement, all the way to Ethan. Ethan listened and nodded. Then he asked why she was telling him all this. She was silent for a long time. The wind ruffled her hair. Then she said it was the mouthpiece. She said she was breathing without pain for the first time in 4 years. She said that every 3 days she leaves it by the basement door, and every 3 days it comes back with a clean filter. She said she doesn't know who's doing it, but she knows. Because there's only one person at the academy who looks at her and sees not the Duke's daughter, but sick lungs. Ethan was silent. Iris turned toward him. Her face was pale in the moonlight. She said her family wanted to kill him, that Cassian would kill him if he found him, that her father had ordered the unknown shooter to be eliminated at any cost, that she was supposed to keep quiet, that by standing on this roof, she was betraying her family. She said all this in an even voice, without a tremor, without tears, like a report. And then she fell silent and pressed her palm to her chest, where her lungs ached. Ethan looked at her, at the Duke's daughter who wanted him dead, at the girl who had been suffocating and silent for 4 years, at the man who had come down to the basement to save the one who had saved her. He said he'd make her a new mouthpiece, with a double filter. It would last a week instead of 3 days. Iris looked at him as if he'd said something in a language she didn't understand. Then her lips twitched. Not a smile, a shadow of a smile. A ghost of what might have been a smile if she'd been allowed to smile. She nodded and left. Ethan acted quickly. That very night, he chopped down the hazel bush behind the basement. The whole thing, right down to the roots. By morning, there was bare earth in its place. He burned the hazel arrows in Minju's forge, every single one. He carved new arrows from ash wood, the same ash used to make every other bow at the academy. Try tracking them. The arrowheads were ordinary. The fletching was standard. Nothing that could be traced back to him. 3 days later, Cassian came to the basement, in person, with 2 assistants. He stood in the courtyard and looked at the spot where the hazel bush had grown. Bare earth, fresh stump marks. Cassian stood there in silence for a minute. Then he turned to his his assistant and said that someone had beaten them to it. The assistant asked who could have known. Cassian didn't answer. He looked up at the windows of the upper wing, where his sister lived. Ethan was watching from the basement window. He saw Cassian looking up. He saw his face harden. Cassian suspected something. Not about Ethan, about Iris. That was bad. That evening, Ji-yoon brought the information. Cassian summoned Iris for a talk. A closed room. Ji-yoon could hear through 3 walls. Cassian asked his sister if she had told anyone about the investigation. Iris replied that she hadn't. Her voice was steady, icy. Cassian said the hazel tree had been cut down the very same night he received the results from the gunsmith. A coincidence. Iris said it might have been the gardener. Cassian was silent for a moment. Then he said he loved her, that everything he does is for the family, that the unknown shooter threatens everything the Valamores have built over generations, that if Iris knows something and stays silent, she's betraying her own blood. Iris replied that she knew nothing. Cassian left. Ji-yoon said he didn't believe her. Ethan sat on his cot and counted. Not meters, not corrections, risks. Cassian suspects Iris. If he starts following his sister, he'll see the mouthpiece. He'll see her leave it by the basement. He'll trace the chain of events. The mouthpiece, the basement, Ethan. We need to change the plan. Ethan made 3 mouthpieces. He gave one to Soyeon, asking her to pass it on. Soyeon didn't ask who it was for. She knew. He left the second one at Minju's smithy. Iris used to go there to order decorative clasps. The third he hid in the library, on a shelf with books on wind magic. Iris read them every week. 3 transfer points. None of them are directly connected to the basement. The chain is broken. Cassian can keep an eye on the basement as much as he wants. The mouthpiece won't be coming to his door anymore. The 21st month. The range had exceeded 1,000 kilometers, 1,200 to be exact. The arrow flew for more than 2 hours. At such distances, Ethan had stopped shooting at individual creatures. He shot at clusters, nests, layers, exit points from the fissures. A single arrow would strike the center of a nest and kill the pack's alpha. Without the alpha, the pack would fall apart. 10 creatures ceased to be a threat without a single shot fired at each of them. Efficiency. Ethan thought in terms of efficiency, not feats, not glory. Units of output per unit of effort expended. By the 22nd month, the rift to the north had narrowed by a quarter. The official explanation from the royal scientists was that the rifts were cyclical in nature. Unofficially, no one understood what was happening. Ethan understood. He was taking fuel from the rift. Every creature killed was energy that did not return to the cycle. The rift feeds on the return. The beasts emerge. They kill. They absorb their victim's life force. They return. Energy flows back into the rift, and it expands. But if the beasts are killed before they reach their victims, the flow is interrupted. The rift starves. It shrinks. Ethan drained the rift the way an engineer drains a swamp. Not with magic, with logistics. The 23rd month. Cassian's intelligence team found something. Not Ethan. A bag of cores. Min-jun had hidden it poorly. Cassian's assistant searched the basement while the cadets were in class and found a bag under Min-jun's bunk. 43 cores, ranging from E rank to B rank, a small fortune. Min-jun was summoned to the director's office. Cassian was present. Min-jun stood before them, white as a sheet. They asked him where the cores came from. He remained silent. They asked him again. He remained silent. Cassian leaned toward him and whispered that he faced expulsion and prison. That selling cores without a license was a crime. That he'd better say where they came from. Min-jun remained silent. Ethan found out about it 10 minutes later. Jian came running in, her eyes full of terror. Ethan got up from his bunk. He took the bag containing the remaining cores from the hiding place, the very largest one, the heavy one, containing over 200 cores ranging from E to a rank. He went upstairs and entered the principal's office. Cassian turned around. The principal raised his hand. Min-jun looked at Ethan with the expression of someone who'd just been hit on the head. Ethan placed the bag on the desk. He untied it. The cores spilled out onto the polished wood. 213 of them. They filled the entire desk and a few fell to the floor. Silence. Cassian looked at the cores, at the bag, at Ethan. Ethan said the cores were his. He said he'd found them. In the forest. In the fields. Everywhere the patrols found dead beasts. He said he'd gone to collect the cores after mop-up operations because F ranks need money and the cores can be sold. He said Min-jun had nothing to do with it. He'd just been hiding some of them under his bunk because there wasn't any room under Ethan's bunk. Cassian listened. His face was impassive. Then he asked how an F-rank archer had managed to get outside the wall past the patrols. Ethan said through a drainage grate. That he's small and can squeeze through. Cassian asked where the B and A rank cores came from. Ethan said he'd found them next to the bodies of the beasts killed by an unknown shooter. The beast is dead. The core is lying there. He picked them up. Cassian stared at him for a long time. Ethan stood there and held his gaze. Slender, skinny, a rumpled uniform, hands with calluses, calm eyes. An F rank who collects cores after others' victories. Pitiful, understandable, logical. Cassian turned to the director and said the case was closed. The cadet had been collecting abandoned cores. A violation of the code, but not a crime. A fine and community service. Min Jun was released. The cores were confiscated, all 213 of them. Ethan walked out of the office. Min Jun walked beside him. He was silent. He stopped on the stairs. He turned to Ethan. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Then he said that Ethan was an idiot, that he'd given away a whole fortune, that the cores were worth more than the entire basement over 100 years. Ethan shrugged and said the cores could be refilled, but Min Jun couldn't be refilled in prison. The last month of the second year. Final exams. Range 1,800 kilometers. Ethan took the exams just like last year, exactly a C. He missed 4 out of 5 shots. In tactics, he answered correctly but slowly. In survival, he got a B. Hannah was grading the exams and her hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she wrote a C next to his name. She knew. She saw. She had kept silent for a year and a half, and every time she gave him a C, something inside her broke. Not out of pity, out of admiration she couldn't show. Ethan approached her after the exam. He thanked her for the U-bow. He said it had served him well. Hannah looked at him and asked how many. Ethan understood the question. He replied, 1,800. Hannah closed her eyes. She opened them. She asked how many kilometers. Ethan nodded. Hannah sat down on a bench. She sat there for a minute. Then she said that her brother used to shoot at 200 meters and was considered the best in his class. Ethan said that her brother would have been better than him if he'd had the time. Hannah shook her head and said it wasn't about time. The thing was, Ethan saw the world as a set of variables and solved it like an equation. But that wasn't something you were born with. It couldn't be taught. She stood up. She placed her hand on his shoulder. She squeezed it, briefly, firmly, and she walked away. Academy graduation day. The second year was over. The grand tournament. The arena. The stands. Thousands of spectators. The king in the box. The Church of the Five Faces in full force. Investigator Revos in the front row. House Valemore, led by the Duke and Cassian. The tournament lasted all day. Combats, magical duels, archery contests. Soyeon competed in the archery events and placed third in her class. D rank in third place among B ranks and above. The hall buzzed. The instructors exchanged glances. Soyeon stood on the podium with her back straight and didn't smile, but her eyes were searching for someone in the crowd. She found him. Ethan was standing in the upper stands among the commoners and nodded to her, barely noticeably. Soyeon nodded back. The final match of the tournament, Nira. Sir Cassian Valemore versus the top A-rank cadet. Cassian won in 30 seconds. Beautiful, brutal, effective. He stood in the center of the arena, bathed in light and smoke, sword in hand. The crowd roared. Cassian raised his hand. Silence. He spoke. He said he knew about the unknown shooter, that the shooter was here, within these walls, that he was a coward hiding behind others' backs, that a true hero faces his opponent head-on rather than shooting from the shadows. Then his voice grew quieter, more menacing. He said that if the shooter didn't come forward right now, he, Cassian Valemore, would execute every F-rank cadet in this graduating class, under martial law, for aiding and abetting, starting with her. He pointed at Soyeon. 2 of Cassian's men had already stepped out of the crowd and grabbed her by the arms. Soyeon didn't struggle. She stood straight. Her back was straight, as always. Silence. The arena was silent. The king was silent. The church was silent. Investigator Revos leaned forward. Ethan stood in the upper stands, 480 meters from the arena. He remembered that distance. He'd memorized it during the quarterly exam when Cassian had sneered at Soyeon's mistakes. He looked at Soyeon, at Claire, who stood in the crowd with her hand pressed to her mouth, at Minjun, who was clenching his fists, at Jiun, who covered her ears with her hands because the roar of the crowd was pounding at her even through her earplugs, at Iris, who stood next to her brother and was slowly turning pale. She understood. She understood before anyone else. At Hannah, who stood among the instructors and looked at Ethan, right at him, and nodded almost imperceptibly. Ethan politely apologized to the person sitting next to him in the stands. He pulled a composite bow from under his cloak. That very one. Minju's work. Horn plates, ashwood, tendon. He placed an ash arrow with a standard triangular tip on the railing, and he spoke quietly, not to Cassian, to himself, out of a habit that had become a part of him. Distance, 480 meters. Wind, westerly, 3.5 meters per second. Altitude correction for the stands, -2 degrees. Drift angle, 1.5 meters to the right. Target, the right wrist. So as not to kill, so as not to wound fatally, so that Sister Iris wouldn't lose her brother. Just the wrist, just the sword to the ground. He drew the bowstring. The compound bow creaked and held. The bowstring dug into the calluses. The calluses held. 2 years of calluses, 200,000 shots, millions of centimeters, all for this moment. He exhaled. He let go. The arrow crossed the arena in a second and a half. Cassian stood in the center with his sword raised. The arrow pierced his right wrist between the plates of his armor, right into the joint. The sword flew out of his hand and clattered against the stones. Cassian screamed. He clutched his hand. Blood gushed between his fingers. The arena erupted. Shouts, screams. Guards rushed toward the stands. Guards rushed toward the arena. Everyone ran, except Ethan. He calmly slung his bow over his back. He began to descend the steps, slowly, step by step, toward the arena, toward So-yun, toward his team. People parted before him, a skinny boy in a rumpled cadet uniform with a compound bow on his back. No one understood. No one believed it. F rank, a wooden bow. Threes, misses, impossible. He walked, and in the corner of his vision, a system window flickered quietly. Target range exceeded. New target detected in the kill zone. Name classified. Continue firing, Ethan Ray Cross. He reached the arena. So-yun stood there, free. Cassian's men had let her go when their master fell to his knees. She looked at Ethan. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling. She was just looking. Just like that night on the roof when he gave her the bow, with the same expression. Claire ran up first. She wrapped her arms around him. She said 3 words. Then she let go and blushed so hard that even her ears turned crimson. Minjun stood beside him. He placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't say anything. Jian smiled her polite smile, but her eyes were shining. Minjun stood at the edge of the arena in a leather apron over her uniform, looking at the bow behind him. Her bow, the one that hadn't broken. Hannah stood among the instructors. She didn't come over, but Ethan saw her crying. Quietly, a single tear, which she wiped away with the back of her hand. Iris stood next to her brother, who was sitting on the rocks, clutching his pierced wrist. She looked at Ethan across the arena. Her face was pale, but there was no hatred in her eyes. There was something else, something Ethan couldn't read from a distance of 480 meters, although he could have hit the wrist from that distance. After the shot rang out in the arena, Ethan's world turned upside down. It became impossible to hide. The king's guards surrounded him within a minute. 20 swords were pointed at the face of a skinny boy in a crumpled uniform. Ethan raised his hands. They took his bow. They took his arrows. They led him to the tower. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. 4 interrogators. 2 officers from the Royal Intelligence Service. Interrogator Revos himself. They asked who he was. They asked how. They asked why. Ethan told the truth. Partially. He said he was an F-rank archer. He said his special ability was trajectory accumulation. He said that every shot added 1 centimeter to his range permanently. He said he'd shot 2,000 times a day for 2 years straight. The interrogators exchanged glances. Revo checked his system window. He saw his class, his rank, his special ability, and the range. 1,800 kilometers. He took 3 steps back from Ethan, sat down in a chair, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and said it was impossible. Ethan replied that it was possible. Math doesn't lie. 1 centimeter per shot, 200,000 shots, 2 kilometers, plus scaling based on the bow's power, plus cumulative accuracy, plus cumulative damage. Revo asked why the system had given him such an ability. Ethan said he didn't know. Revo asked if he knew that not a single S-rank had been born in 30 years. Ethan said he knew. Revo was silent for a moment. Then he asked quietly if Ethan knew that the system wasn't a gift from the goddess. Ethan froze. Revo looked at him with clear eyes. Then he said that the church kept records. Old records, very old. From before the system, before the rifts, before the ranks. 200 years ago, there were neither classes nor beings. There was only the world, an ordinary one. Then someone came. Not Asteria, someone else. He brought the system. He brought the rifts. He divided people into ranks, and he forbade growth. F rank remains F rank. A rank remains A rank. A ceiling. For everyone. Forever. Except. Revos pointed at Ethan. Except for those like him. Revos pulled an old parchment from the folds of his clothes. He unfolded it. On it were 7 names, 7 dates, 7 class markings, all F rank. All with unusual passives. A swordsman with strike accumulation. A mage with spell accumulation. A healer with heal accumulation. 7 of them. Over 200 years. All dead. Revos said the church found the first 120 years after the system's emergence. A swordsman. He had accumulated 1,000,000 strikes over 10 years. He could have cleaved a mountain in 2. He was killed in his sleep. The church doesn't know exactly who it was. But after his death, the system updated itself. The rifts narrowed for a day, and then they widened again, as if someone had patched a hole in the wall, and it immediately appeared somewhere else. Revo said the system is a cage. The rifts are the bars, the ranks are the locks, and people like Ethan are the keys. Loopholes, left there intentionally by someone. Why? Revos didn't know, but he knew that every time a key was destroyed, the system grew stronger. It became tougher. The rank ceilings were lowered. S ranks stopped being born, because whoever was behind the system learned from its mistakes. It closed the gaps. It perfected the cage. Ethan listened and thought. 7 before him, all dead, all killed before they had a chance to grow. He was the 8th. And he had grown. Because he'd been hiding. Because he was a pathetic F rank in plain sight. Because no one was looking for the impossible. He asked Revos where the one behind the system was. Revos shook his head. He said he didn't know. But the system knows. It showed Ethan, in the arena, new target in the strike zone, classified. Ethan closed his eyes. He opened the system window. He found the line that had been flashing since the shot was fired in the arena. New target in the strike zone. Distance. He looked at the distance and his heart skipped a beat. 2,400 kilometers. To the south. Across the sea. Beyond the mountains. Beyond the edge of every map he'd ever seen. Where no human had ever set foot. The target was in the strike zone. His arrow could reach it. His range was 1,800. He was 600 kilometers short. Several months of shooting, maybe less with a compound bow. Revos asked what he saw. Ethan opened his eyes and replied. 2,400 kilometers. To the south. Revos turned pale. The south is the Deadlands. The place from which the rifts came 200 years ago. The place marked in black on the maps. The place where no one goes because no one ever returns from there. Ethan stood up. He said he needed his bow back. Revos looked at him with a long, heavy gaze. Then he nodded. He gave the order. The bow was returned. The arrows were returned. Ethan was released, not because they had forgiven him for shooting Cassian, but because Revos understood. If Ethan made it all the way to the Deadlands, the world would change. In what way, the interrogator did not know. But the cage in which humanity had been trapped for 200 years was worth the risk. Ethan left the tower at dawn. They were waiting for him in the courtyard, everyone. So-Yun with his bow, which she'd taken from the guards before they could hide it. Claire with hand ointment. Min-Jun with a flask of water. Ji-Yoon with a map on which she'd already marked the direction south. Min-Jun with spare bowstrings and 100 arrowheads. And Hannah, she stood slightly to the side, holding a quiver. A full one. 30 arrows made of the finest ash wood, fletched with hawk feathers. She'd made them that night, while he was sitting in the tower. Ethan looked at them. At the 7 people standing in the academy courtyard in the dawn light. At those whom the system had written off. F ranks, E ranks, D ranks. A former B rank instructor who had never been able to save her brother. A C rank blacksmith who wanted to forge real weapons. A scout who hadn't slept in 5 years. A healer who was afraid of blood. An archer with trembling hands, a swordsman with asthma, and him, an engineer from Alabama in the body of a boy with a wooden bow. Minju was standing there too. She had come from the forge with soot still wet on her cheek and silently took her place in line. Ethan picked up the bow. He picked up the quiver. He looked south. 600 kilometers. He had to shoot. Ethan shot. 60 days in a row. Without hiding. Without apologizing. without pretending. The academy had given him the roof of the East Tower, the highest point, the clearest view to the south. Hannah secured permission from the director, who, after speaking with Revos, stopped asking questions and began signing the paperwork. Ethan shot from dawn until dusk. So-yeon handed him arrows. Claire rubbed ointment on his hands every 2 hours. Min-jun carried water and food. Ji-eun listened to the wind at all altitudes and reported her findings. Min-ju forged arrowheads in batches of 50 and hauled them up to the tower in a bucket. Hannah stood beside him and counted along with him. She couldn't count like he could, but she knew the winds. She knew the weather. She knew how the pressure changed before a storm, and that helped. The range was increasing. 1900, 2000, 2100, 10 kilometers every day. The compound bow added 3 centimeters per shot. 1,000 shots a day. 30 kilometers. But Ethan shot more than 1,000. 1,500. Sometimes 2,000. His hands bled even through the calluses. Claire healed them with magic, and they bled again an hour later. So-yeon would silently take the bow from him when she saw that he couldn't bend his fingers. She made him eat. She made him drink. She made him sleep for at least 4 hours. He slept and saw numbers, adjustments, trajectories, formulas. They became his dreams, his breath, his heartbeat. Cassian left the academy with a bandaged wrist and fury in his eyes. House Valamore declared Ethan an enemy of the house. The Duke demanded his arrest. The king was silent. The church was silent. Revos was silent. Everyone waited. Iris stayed. She came to the tower on the 3rd day. She stood at the parapet and watched Ethan shoot. 1 hour, 2, 3. Then she approached. She stood next to So-yeon and began handing him arrows. So-yeon looked at her. Iris looked at So-yeon. Something silent and heavy passed between them. Then So-yeon moved over, and Iris stood beside her. From that day on, she came every day. She breathed through a double-filtered mouthpiece and handed him arrows. The daughter of the Duke who wanted to kill the man to whom she was handing arrows. She didn't speak of it. No one spoke. She was simply there. On the 40th day, the range reached 2,200 kilometers. 200 remained. Ethan stood at the edge of the tower and looked south. The horizon. Beyond the horizon, the sea. Beyond the sea lay mountains. Beyond the mountains lay the dead lands. There sat the entity that had built a cage for all of humanity. It had sat there for 200 years. It had killed 7 before him. It had created the rifts and the beasts, the ranks and the ceilings. It had decided that F rank must die in the basement. It was wrong. On the 50th day, the range was 2,300, 100 kilometers, 3 days of shooting. Ethan counted and fired, counted and fired. Min-ju brought a new bowstring. The old one snapped on the 1,500th shot of the day. The new one was made of mountain bull tendons woven together, triple weave. Min-ju spent 2 days making it. The bowstring held up. On the 58th day, the range was 2,390, 10 kilometers, 1 day. Ethan shot until dark. So-yeon handed him arrows. Claire treated his hands. Min-jun stood by the stairs and wouldn't let anyone onto the tower. Ji-yoon listened. Hannah gauged the wind. Min-ju sat by the wall and sharpened the arrowheads. Iris stood at the parapet and looked south. She breathed through the mouthpiece, steadily, calmly, without coughing. On the 59th day, in the morning, the system window flashed. Range, 2,400 kilometers. Target within range. Ethan lowered his bow. He looked at the window, at the line glowing with an even white light. Target within range. Classified. A new line appeared next to it, one he hadn't seen before. The coordinates of the target have been determined. Readiness to fire confirmed. Another one below. The arrow remembers the target. A side effect. If Ethan had seen the target in person even once, he could have fired from memory. But he hadn't seen the target. He didn't know what was there, who was there. He knew only the distance and the direction. And he knew that 200,000 shots had brought him here. To the roof of the tower, in a foreign world, in a foreign body. With a bow forged by a girl in a leather apron. With arrows he'd whittled at night. With calluses that had become his skin. Ethan looked at his team. So-yeon stood to his right, bow on her shoulder. Back straight. Her hands didn't tremble. Claire stood to his left, mask around her neck, eyes clear. Min-jun behind him, breathing evenly, no wheezing. Ji-yoon at the edge of the tower, eyes closed, listening. Min-ju by the wall, hands covered in soot, eyes shining. Hannah at the parapet, upright, calm, like a bow before a shot. Iris next to Hannah, mouthpiece in hand, breathing even. For the first time in years, 7 people. Those whom the system had written off. Those he repaired at night. A bow for trembling hands, a mask for the fear of blood, a mouthpiece for diseased lungs, an inhaler for asthma, earplugs for the ringing in the head, gloves for weak fingers, a real bow for a real blacksmith. Each piece was care disguised as precision. Every millimeter of tolerance was love he couldn't put into words. They stood here because he had fixed them, and he stood here because they had covered for him. Ethan turned south. He raised his compound bow. He nocked an arrow, the last one from the quiver that Hannah had filled with a hawk's feathers. The shaft was made of ash. The tip was standard, triangular. Minju's work. Nothing special, just an arrow, like thousands of others. But behind it lay 200,000 shots. 2 years, millions of centimeters, each one driven in by his hands. His pain, his sleepless nights, his formulas, his calculations, his engineer's stubbornness, which wouldn't let him stop. Ethan began to count. Out loud, out of habit. Distance, 2,400 kilometers. Wind at tower level, northwest, 4 meters per second. Wind at the apogee of the trajectory, presumably westerly, 12 meters per second. Coriolis correction for 2,400 kilometers, 47 meters. Surface curvature at this distance. He stopped. He looked at the arrow, at an ordinary wooden arrow with a triangular tip. It couldn't wash 2,400 kilometers, physically. No arrow could, but the system said it could, because range isn't flight distance. Range is the distance to the target, the accumulation of trajectories. 200,000 shots. Each one added not just a centimeter to the flight. Each one added a centimeter to the inevitability of a hit. The arrow won't fly 2,400 kilometers along a parabola. It will fly as far as it can, and then it will veer toward the target, because the arrow remembers the target, because the accuracy accumulated over 200,000 shots has ceased to be mere accuracy. It has become inevitability. Ethan pulled the bowstring taut, to the limit. The compound bow groaned. The horn plates arched. The ash wood cracked. The tendons stretched tight as a string. Minju clenched her fists. She held the bow steady. Ethan held his breath. He looked up at the sky. Blue, clear, alien. His sky, already his. He exhaled, and quietly said to himself, "If you assigned me an F rank and decided that I would die in the basement, then I've come to explain to you where the error lies in your calculations." He released the bowstring. The arrow shot into the sky, vertically, like a rocket. It rose and rose until it became a dot and vanished. Silence. They stood on the tower and waited. 1 minute, 5, 10, 20. So-yeon stood beside him, holding his hand. Her fingers didn't tremble. Claire stood there, biting her lip. Minjun looked south and breathed steadily. Ji-eun listened, eyes closed. Palms cupped over her ears, earplugs removed. She listened at full volume. A kilometer away. 10 kilometers. 100. As far as she could. Minju stood there, staring at the bow in Ethan's hands. Her bow, the one that hadn't broken. Hannah stood there, silent. Iris stood there, breathing. 37 minutes later, the world shook. Not a metaphor. The ground swayed beneath their feet. The tower creaked. The sky to the south flashed with white light. Like lightning, but not lightning. The light shot upward from the horizon, in a column, up to the clouds, and higher. Ji-eun screamed and covered her ears. She said she could hear it, far away, very far away. A sound, not a roar, not a scream, a ringing, as if something enormous and glassy had cracked, and was shattering, shard by shard. Ethan stood and stared at the light in the south. In his system window, lines changed one after another. Target destroyed. Critical damage. System integrity compromised. Rank restrictions lifted. Fault lines deactivated. Then the screen flickered, and the final line appeared. The one he hadn't expected, but the one that explained everything. "Thank you, 8th, you did it. I'm free." Not he, she. The entity behind the system wasn't the jailer, she was the prisoner. Someone had imprisoned her in the Deadlands 200 years ago, built a cage out of ranks, faults, and creatures, used her power to keep the world in check, and she tried 8 times to raise someone who could shoot far enough to shatter the lock. 7 didn't make it. The 8th did. Ethan lowered his bow. He watched the white light slowly fade in the south. The earth stopped trembling. The sky returned to its usual color. But something had changed. The air felt lighter, as if the pressure that had weighed down on the world for 200 years had suddenly vanished. Jian said that the rift north of the academy had closed. It just closed. The sound stopped. The beast's footsteps vanished. Silence. True silence. For the first time in 200 years. All over the world, rifts were closing one after another. The beasts crumbled to dust. The system windows of every person in Illyrian and refreshed. Rank restrictions were lifted. F ranks became simply people. A ranks became simply people. There were no more ceilings. Everyone could grow, without limit, just as it should be. Ethan stood on the tower and looked out at the world that had just become free. The last line glowed quietly in his system window. Current range, 2,400,000 meters. He's an engineer. He calculates corrections for Earth's rotation for projectiles flying beyond the horizon. He came from Alabama to a world that locked him in a basement and gave him a wooden bow. And from that basement, he shot so far that he hit the wall of the cell itself. So-yeon stood beside him, her hand in his, warm, not trembling. Claire was saying something, but he couldn't hear her. Minjun sat on the floor of the tower and, for the first time in 2 years, breathed deeply. Not because of the inhaler. It was because the system that had been restricting his lungs had ceased to exist. Minjun held the fragments of the bowstring that had snapped at the moment of the last shot. She looked at them and smiled. The bowstring had held out exactly as long as it needed to, not a second less. Hannah was crying, not quietly, out loud. For the first time in 10 years, her brother had been an F-rank archer. He died because the world decided that F-rank was worthless. The world won't decide that again. Iris was breathing without a mouthpiece, deeply, fully, without pain, without coughing. The system was no longer devouring her lungs. She was free, just like everyone else. Ji-yoon listened to the silence. For the first time in her life, the silence wasn't empty. It was real. Not because of earplugs, because the world had finally fallen silent. Ethan looked south. The light had faded. The sky was clear. The horizon was flat. Somewhere out there, beyond the sea and the mountains, lay the ruins of what had kept the world caged for 200 years. Shattered by a single arrow. An arrow made of ash wood with a triangular tip. One he had whittled at night in the basement. Between 2,000 practice shots, he turned to his team. 7 people. His family. The ones for whom it was worth firing 200,000 shots. He said they needed to go downstairs, to eat, to rest, and to decide what to do with a world in which there were no longer any ceilings. So-young nodded. Claire said she was starving. Minjun was already heading for the stairs. Ji-yoon ran ahead. Minju went to the blacksmith shop because she had an order for the morning and the client hadn't canceled. Hannah wiped her eyes and squared her shoulders. Iris went last. She stopped at the door, turned around, looked at Ethan, and smiled. Not a shadow of a smile, not a ghost, a real smile. The first one in so many years that she'd forgotten how to do it. Ethan smiled back. Then he turned toward the parapet. He looked south one last time. The final line flashed in the system window and went dark. The class system has been deactivated. Thanks for the shoot. Ethan smirked. He took off his compound bow. He hung it on the tower wall, next to the U one he'd brought up from the basement, next to the wooden one the priest had given him 2 years ago. 3 bows, 3 eras, 20 meters, 1,800 kilometers, 2,400,000 meters. He stroked the wooden bow with his fingertips. That very one. The crooked one. The cracked one. With the sagging string. The one that started it all. 1 centimeter, forever. Then he turned and walked downstairs. To his people. To dinner. To a life in a world without a cage. His footsteps faded on the stairs. 3 bows and silence remained on the tower, and the wind blowing from the south. Warm. Free. For the first time in 200 years.